In 1984, American police did something they had never done before in their history. They walked into the cell of the most dangerous serial killer on death row to ask him for help. Why? Because there was another killer out there. A killer who left no trace, no fingerprint, not even a face anyone could remember. A girl would vanish from the street. Weeks later, her body would surface on a riverbank. Then another, and the police were completely helpless. What they did not know at the time was that the killer was sitting among them. He went to church every Sunday. He wept during sermons. He kept a photo of his son in his car, and at night, he would return to the forest to dig open the graves with his own hands, just to make sure the only witness against him was still dead. This is not fiction. This is Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, and the details you are about to hear are stranger than any film. Before we go deep into this story, if you love true and mysterious stories, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, and leave a like so this video reaches as many people as possible. And tell me in the comments, how do you think this man fooled a lie detector for 20 whole years? Keep your answer in your mind until the end of the video. Now turn off the lights, and let me take you 20 years back to the city of Seattle, where it all began. In 1984, the investigators in the United States were living in a state of total helplessness. In front of them was one of the strangest and most complex serial murder cases in history. Girls vanished from the streets without warning, and after a while their bodies appeared dumped in the forests. No evidence, no fingerprint, no trace pointing to the identity of the killer. When the investigation hit a dead end, the police made a shocking and unconventional decision. They went to prison to make a deal with one of the most dangerous serial killers in American history. His name was Ted Bundy. He sat behind bars waiting for his execution. They offered him a tempting deal. Help us crack the mind of this new killer, and we will change your sentence from execution to life in prison. Ted Bundy agreed. The investigators sat with him for long hours, trying to understand the psychology of a serial killer. How does he think? How does he keep hiding his crimes all this time without being exposed? Bundy gave them many details that later proved to be 100% true. But the most dangerous thing he said, the sentence that changed 20 years of investigation completely, was this: the killer usually returns to the bodies after burying or dumping them. He returns to make sure the only witness against him, the dead victim, is still under the soil and has not been discovered. The investigators had caught the end of a thread, but they had no idea that the man holding the other end of it was living right beside them. The real story began in the early 80s. In the city of Seattle, police stations started receiving report after report of girls disappearing suddenly and mysteriously. At first, the police did not pay much attention, because the common thread between the girls was their difficult social situation. Some had run away from home. Some worked the streets. Some lived in harsh conditions. The police assumed the disappearance of such people was natural and not worth an alarm. Then everything turned upside down. The bodies began to appear. They appeared near the riverbanks and in the arms of the forests surrounding the city. Bodies of young girls, dumped in isolated places, in a brutal way. And with every new body, the terror grew and spread through the city. What made it worse was the absence of any evidence. No real witnesses, no accurate description of the killer, no clear method that showed how he chose his victims. And the number kept rising at a terrifying speed. Almost daily, traditional serial killers target a specific type, a certain look, a certain age, a repeated method. But this killer was completely different. Each time he targeted a girl of a different age and look, and killed her in a way completely different from the last. This scattering made tracking his movements and predicting his next step impossible. The American press gave him a name that would stay in history: the Green River Killer. The only constant pattern he had was where he dumped the bodies, either near the river or in the forest. And while the city was drowning in terror, there was one man who knew the whole truth, but he was not a policeman. During the same period the city was drowning in the blood of its victims, there was an American citizen named Gary Ridgway. He was a regular visitor to a therapist's office, but his sessions were not for treatment. They were just a way to unload what was happening in his mind. Before he said a single word, he did something very clever. He confirmed the therapist's medical credentials himself and reviewed the patient confidentiality agreement with him. He wanted to be sure that anything he said inside that room would never leave it, and would never reach the police or the courts. Because the law protects the privacy of a psychiatric patient, and forbids the doctor from reporting him, even if he were accused of major crimes. Once he was reassured, he began to tell his story. He spoke of a childhood full of tension and problems. His relationship with his mother was extremely bad. He feared her deeply, and at the same time held a sick attachment to her. He described the house he grew up in as something like a mental asylum. Screaming, anger, daily beatings. That twisted environment made his behavior grow around three terrifying axes: violence, desire, and fear. He lived all three of these feelings at once. Then he told a story he did not know would explain everything. He told the therapist a strange incident that happened when he was 16. That day, he spotted a small child. He followed him into the forest for no clear reason. He pounced on him and tried to kill him and attack him. But the strange part of the story was that while he was trying to strangle the child, he was overcome by intense fear and panic. He started screaming and crying out loud while trying to commit the crime. And because of his hysterical screaming, some people near the forest heard the sound and ran toward it. Gary sensed their movement and realized he was about to be caught. So he left the child and ran. By a miracle, the child survived, and because of that strange behavior, Gary survived punishment too, and his life went on. But the monster inside him had begun to wake up. After high school, Gary joined the American Army and was sent to serve in the Vietnam War. There, the fear inside him doubled. But he found fertile ground to practice killing and crime against the Vietnamese, and he entered into multiple relationships with women of bad reputation. And despite all this evil, when he returned to America, he managed to keep a calm and completely normal image in front of his family, his friends, and his co-workers. No one sensed anything strange. He married, he worked in a truck factory, and he lived a stable life. Those around him described him as a quiet, tidy, shy, simple man. But inside him was a volcano of evil he did not understand himself. He kept asking the therapist, "Why am I like this?" And the therapist would calm him, telling him it was a temporary state that would pass. But the therapist could see what no one else could: the family violence, the fear tangled with the desire for revenge, the savagery of Vietnam, the vast contradiction between his outer calm and his buried desire to kill. And at the end of Gary's secret file, he wrote a terrifying sentence based on the diagnosis of Gary Ridgway: "I am now sitting with a serial killer. Most likely Gary is the Green River Killer." But just as Gary had demanded from the start, he kept complete silence to protect his profession and his future. And so the most dangerous secret in the city stayed locked inside a medical file. Gary went on with his life as a committed conservative man. He went to church every Sunday. He took part in community work. He read the Bible. He even wept with exaggerated devotion during the sermons. But his wife in that period noticed strange symptoms. Suddenly, with no reason, he would fall into violent fits of rage, smashing everything around him. She described him as living a silent war inside his head. He would sit and move his hands and face constantly, as if two personalities were fighting inside his mind. The first, religious and calm. The second, evil and angry. And as thousands of reports and names poured in, the number of suspects passed 1,700 names, and among them was one name: Gary Ridgway. The reason was that a witness saw his car near the last place a girl disappeared. Other reports said a respectable-looking man was driving his car around the girls, offering them rides. And the description of the car matched Gary's car exactly. Some girls rode with him, some refused, and one who was seen getting into a car like his disappeared later. The police called Gary in for serious questioning for the first time. He sat in front of the investigators with unbelievable coldness and steadiness. No nervousness, no breakdown, not a single movement that raised suspicion. They tried every method of psychological pressure on him, with no result. And when they asked him to take a lie detector test, he agreed immediately, without hesitation. He sat on the machine for 4 full hours. A standard test takes 20 to 40 minutes and is enough to expose a criminal's lies. But through every stage of the test, the machine showed one result: Gary is 100% honest, and he has nothing to do with the crimes. And with no physical evidence, the police were forced to declare him innocent and drop the charges. He returned to his home and his work, as if nothing had happened, and no one realized that they had just set the monster free. After walking out innocent and passing the lie detector, his confidence grew in a terrifying way. He realized the police had nothing against him, and that his method of killing was safe. He did not chase his victims by force in the streets. Instead, he used his calm features and his soft voice to gain their trust quickly, and many times he would place a photo of his young son inside the car, so he would appear in front of the girls as a gentle father who could never do any harm. The fear would leave their hearts, and they would get in with him. Killing became a daily routine for him, like going to a job. He woke up in the morning and worked at the truck factory with full dedication, and at night he went out to hunt a new victim. He took her to an isolated place. He assaulted her. Then he killed her in cold blood, without a single flinch or a single pang of guilt. But the strangest part was not the killing alone, it was what he did after. As the months passed, a fixed geographic pattern became clear to the police. The bodies always appeared in isolated forests, in places hard to watch, around Seattle and the Green River. And here the investigators remembered Ted Bundy's advice. They began watching the sites. And it turned out the advice was true. Gary really was returning to the bodies of his victims. Days and weeks later, he would check them and make sure the only witness was still buried under the soil. And during these visits, he would move some remains and change the location of evidence to confuse the investigation completely. In the eyes of the residents, the forests of Seattle turned into ghost zones, a source of absolute terror, and the case slipped out of the control of the authorities, both in the media and in the public mind. Rumors and legends began to weave around the Green River Killer. People in the streets said he was a giant with enormous physical strength, a former boxer. Others spread that he broke into houses and kidnapped women, and another rumor said he was backed by the Soviet Union, and that the crimes were carried out by an entire hidden unit, not one man. And fame is the fuel that feeds the sadism of a serial killer. So when Gary saw his name filling the world, the channels and newspapers talking about the helplessness of the police, a rush of victory and delusion of grandeur took over him. He increased the pace of killing. On some days, he killed 2 girls in one night, instead of 1. The police doubled the patrols and spread officers on every corner, but he kept moving among them like a ghost. And once he went out on a volunteer trip with a church scout group. His eye caught a girl. He followed her, killed her, and dumped her body in the forest. Then he returned to his companions at the church and went back to playing the devout man. Then, suddenly, something happened the police never expected. The crime stopped. Suddenly and shockingly, the rate of crimes dropped sharply. After killing around 10 girls a month, he was now killing 1. Then the crimes stopped completely. A full year and a half passed, with not a single crime in the city. The police were baffled. They thought the killer was maybe dead, or had traveled, or had been jailed for another case. But the real reason was very strange. Gary Ridgway had entered a new relationship and married for the 3rd time. His 3rd wife later described their life as ideal and completely normal. He was a devoted husband. He went to work, came home to help her with the housework, and spent all his time with her. He loved her and grew deeply attached to her. And for the sake of this love, he decided to stop his inner monster and stop killing completely, to live in peace with her. He would say later in his confessions with sarcasm, "The strange irony is that during the time I decided to stop, the opportunities appeared in front of me everywhere, easily. But I refused and resisted for the sake of my wife. But this stopping was not true repentance. It was just a warrior's rest, and the monster, still crouched inside him, was waiting." With the arrival of the 90s and the start of the new millennium, forensic science advanced in a revolutionary way. DNA testing appeared, a technology able to identify any criminal from a tiny sample. Even decades later, the investigators returned to the old storage rooms and opened the files of the Green River Killer. They tested the preserved samples of hair and saliva from the victims, the ones they had collected in the 80s, which had no value at the time because the technology was weak. And as the analysis advanced, one name appeared, again, and strongly: Gary Ridgway. But this time, not based on suspicion or testimony, but on conclusive scientific evidence linking him directly to the bodies of the victims. The police placed Gary under close surveillance. They analyzed his every move, but he did nothing suspicious. From his home to his work, from his work to the church. A quiet, gentle life. And on the 30th of November, in the year 2001, the police made their decisive move. The forces stormed the truck factory. They arrested Gary Ridgway and cuffed him in front of the shock and disbelief of his co-workers. And when an officer told the workers, "This is the Green River Killer," No one believed him. They thought it was a heavy joke. Even his wife came out with angry statements, threatening to sue the police for destroying the reputation of her innocent, perfect husband. But what Gary revealed in the interrogation room was worse than every charge. Gary entered the interrogation room, and here came the surprise no one expected. From the very first session, instead of denial or resistance, he began to confess to everything, in detail, with complete calm, without a single tear falling from his eye. Without a single sign of remorse, he remembered the smallest details. In the early years, he recorded the names and information of his victims in a small notebook, but he told them that once he forgot to record the name of one victim. And after that, he stopped writing completely, because killing had become an ordinary, repeated thing for him, like drinking water. And he confirmed the truth of Ted Bundy's analysis. He said, "I used to see the girls I killed in my sleep. So I would wake at night and go to the forest where I buried them. And I would dig up the grave a little, just to look at the body and make sure it was still dead and had not moved, and to be sure my secret was buried with her." Then he added a terrifying sentence, found word for word in Ted Bundy's confession files too. "The most beautiful and most dangerous look a serial killer can ever have is the final look in the victim's eye as she breathes her last. That look, if I lived 1,000 years, I could never forget." And when they asked him the secret of passing the lie detector in the 80s, despite being the real killer, the answer came from the medical tests. It turned out Gary had very slow nerve signals, numb to emotion, a man half drugged from the inside. He felt no fear, no tension, no pang of conscience. So when the investigators questioned him, and the machine measured his pulse, his pressure, his changes, his body showed no reaction at all, as if he were talking about the weather. And he added, "I did nothing new in America. I just came back and carried out the same scenario I had trained on, the one I did daily in the Vietnam War. And I was at peace with the idea of being exposed at any moment. So nothing mattered to me." Then Gary dropped a thundering bomb. He declared that he had killed 1,058 girls, and that there was a large number more that he had forgotten completely with time. And during the searches, he led the police to secret sites in the forests, and they really found around 180 bodies, buried and decomposed. Most of them were homeless women and illegal migrants who had entered the country without anyone knowing they existed, and so no one had ever reported them missing. But before he gave all these details and pointed out the locations of the bodies the authorities could never find on their own, he set one condition. "A plea deal?" he said. "I will confess everything to you, and I will lead you to bodies you would never find in your whole lives. But in return, my execution is absolutely forbidden. I want prison only." The court agreed to close the file and learn the fate of the missing girls. And in the end, despite his confession to 1,058 crimes and leading them to 180 bodies, the court proved only 48 murders against him in an official legal way, for procedural and judicial reasons specific to the American courts that remain not fully understood to this day. And on that basis, the historic verdict was issued: prison for more than 1,000 years, with no chance of parole, no bail, no reduction of the sentence. Gary Ridgway is still behind bars, alive, to this very day. And the astonishing thing is that he is still in constant contact with his therapist, the same therapist who sat with him in the 80s and wrote in his file that he was the Green River Killer. And the therapist quotes Gary as saying that there are dozens of other stories, uglier, stranger, more monstrous, but he flatly refuses to reveal them or allow them to be published to any party. Gary became rich material for filmmakers. Hundreds of films, series and documentaries were made about him, and he was officially classified as one of the strangest and most dangerous serial killers in human history. And now, take your memory back to the start of the video. The question I asked you, how did he fool a lie detector for 20 years? The answer was not intelligence, and not a trick. It was that this man simply felt nothing at all. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments the detail that shocked you the most. Living in Oak Ridge Heights hasn't been particularly remarkable for a 17-year-old like me. The suburban monotony would have been unbearable if not for my private sanctuary, a small, forgotten patch of woods sandwiched between our neighborhood and the highway bypass. Most people avoid it, thinking it's too small to be worth exploring or too close to the road to be peaceful. Their oversight has become my privilege. Every day after school, I follow the same ritual. I slip out our back door, cut through Mrs. Wilson's neglected garden. She's too elderly to maintain it anymore and doesn't mind my shortcut. And within 5 minutes, I'm at the entrance to my wooded haven. It's nothing spectacular, maybe 15 acres at most, but the trees grow dense enough to muffle the distant traffic and create the illusion of wilderness. I'm what you might call a practiced loner. Making friends has never come easily to me, and high school hasn't improved matters. The woods became my confidant, the place where I shed the forced smiles and awkward silences that define my school days. I've mapped every trail, memorized the location of every distinctive tree, and claimed a particular fallen log as my thinking spot. April 16th started like any other Tuesday. The sky hung overcast, threatening rain but withholding it, casting the world in a flat gray light. School had been particularly draining. 2 surprise quizzes, a mandatory pep rally for a sport I couldn't care less about, and lunch spent avoiding the tables of chattering classmates who never seemed to notice my absence. By 3 o'clock, I felt the familiar itch beneath my skin, the need to escape into solitude. I rushed home, changed into my usual outfit, worn jeans, a navy hoodie, and mud-caked hiking boots that had seen better days, and grabbed my backpack with the essentials: water bottle, sketchbook, and a granola bar. Back by dinner, I called out to my mother, who barely looked up from her laptop where she was finishing work projects. She raised a hand in acknowledgement, used to my afternoon disappearances. The damp air carried the scent of approaching rain as I navigated the entrance path, fallen leaves compacted from years of my solitary footsteps. I pushed my earbuds in, scrolling through my phone until finding a true crime podcast, background noise to accompany my thoughts. The familiar embrace of the woods welcomed me, branches creating a canopy overhead that darkened the already gloomy afternoon. Something about the quality of light that day made the shadows deeper, the silence between podcast segments more pronounced. But I dismissed the sensation, chalking it up to the weather and my already sour mood. I couldn't have known that this ordinary Tuesday would become the dividing line in my life, the before and after. That the woods I thought I knew would reveal something that would haunt my every waking moment and turn my dreams into nightmares that left me gasping in the dark. The first raindrops began to fall, pattering against the leaves above me as I ventured deeper into the trees, following a path I could have walked blindfolded. About 20 minutes into my walk, I decided to deviate from my usual route. A recent rainstorm had toppled a large oak, creating a new clearing I hadn't fully explored. The podcast in my ears had shifted to an advertisement break, so I lowered the volume and focused on navigating the uneven ground, stepping carefully over exposed roots and fallen branches. The new clearing had transformed since my last visit. Spring had brought a carpet of tiny white wildflowers and an explosion of mushrooms thriving in the damp conditions. I knelt to examine a particularly interesting cluster of fungi, their caps a vibrant orange against the dark soil. My biology teacher might appreciate a photo for extra credit. Rising to my feet, I decided to circle the entire fallen tree before heading to my usual spot. That's when my foot connected with something that immediately registered as wrong. The texture beneath my boot wasn't the springy forest floor or the crunch of dead leaves. Instead, it yielded in a way that sent immediate signals of alarm through my nervous system. The sensation was unmistakably like stepping on flesh. I yanked my foot back instinctively, stumbling backward and nearly falling. My heart hammered against my ribcage as I tore my earbuds out, suddenly needing all my senses alert. The forest sounds rushed in. Birds, distant traffic, the soft patter of increasing rain. But they seemed distant compared to the blood pulsing in my ears. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to look down at what I'd stepped on. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. There, partially obscured by fallen leaves and perfectly integrated with the surrounding soil, was a human face. Not a mask, not a doll. A face, with detailed features emerging from the earth itself, as if someone had been buried vertically with only their face pressing against the surface. The craftsmanship was impossible. Every detail was rendered with photographic precision. Pores, the slight asymmetry of natural features, even fine wrinkles around the closed eyes. The coloration matched the surrounding dirt perfectly, yet the textures shifted subtly across the features, smoother across the forehead, slightly rougher along the jawline. My footprint had left an impression on what appeared to be the cheek. But instead of staying compressed like soil should, the imprint was already reforming, the surface slowly returning to its original shape like flesh bouncing back after pressure. I crouched down, my curiosity momentarily overriding my fear. The face appeared to belong to a middle-aged man, his expression serene, almost as if sleeping. No signs of distress marked his features, just peaceful repose. "Hello?" I whispered, feeling immediately foolish. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. Yet it was so lifelike that addressing it seemed natural. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I reached out one trembling finger and touched the forehead. It was warm. Not sun-warmed soil warm, but body temperature warm. And the texture, God, the texture was unmistakably skin, slightly moist with the subtle elasticity of living tissue. When the eyelids flickered, time seemed to stop. A minute movement, just the faintest tremor beneath the soil-colored lids, but unmistakable. And then, horrifyingly, the lips parted slightly, releasing a soft exhalation of air that stirred the nearby leaves. Terror exploded through me. A scream tore from my throat, echoing through the trees and scattering nearby birds from their perches. I scrambled backward, my hands and feet slipping on wet leaves as I struggled to put distance between myself and the impossible face. Once upright, I ran. Branches whipped against my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. My backpack bounced painfully against my spine, and my abandoned earbuds dangled from my pocket, the tinny sound of the podcast still playing, creating a surreal soundtrack to my flight. The upbeat voice discussing murder statistics felt like a twisted joke as I fled from something I couldn't begin to comprehend. I burst through our back door at 4:17 p.m. I remember checking my phone with shaking hands, trying to ground myself in something normal. The 17 minutes since my discovery felt like hours. My mother looked up from her laptop, alarm spreading across her face as she took in my appearance. I must have been a sight. Clothes muddied from my frantic escape, face scratched from branches, eyes wild with panic. "What happened?" She pushed back from the dining table, knocking over her coffee mug in her rush to reach me. Words failed me initially. How could I explain what I'd seen, what I'd touched? Eventually, I managed to stammer out fragments. "The woods. There's a face. In the ground. I touched it. It moved. Slow down," she said, guiding me to a chair. "Deep breaths. What face?" "In the dirt. A human face, like someone buried vertically with just their face showing. But it's part of the ground somehow." The words sounded insane even as I spoke them. "I stepped on it by accident, and it felt like skin, warm skin." My mother's expression shifted from concern to skepticism. "You probably saw an animal partially buried, or maybe some trash someone dumped that looked human-shaped." "No." I was adamant, the sensation of that warm flesh beneath my fingertip impossible to dismiss. "I know what I saw, what I touched. It blinked, Mom. Its lips moved." She studied my face, clearly trying to decide how to handle what she perceived as either a delusion or an overactive imagination. "Did you take any pictures?" she finally asked. The question hit me like a slap. Of course, my phone had been in my pocket the entire time. Why hadn't I documented it? "I panicked," I admitted. "I just ran." "Well," she said, her voice taking on that carefully measured tone adults use when humoring someone. "Let's go look at it together tomorrow, in the daylight. If there's something strange out there, we should report it." I nodded, though the prospect of returning filled me with dread. We agreed to check after she finished work the next day. She insisted I shower and change, suggesting the physical routine would help calm my nerves. Later that evening, as we ate dinner in uncomfortable silence, I could feel her watching me, concerned. I picked at my food, appetite gone, my mind replaying the encounter in endless loops. That night, sleep came in fitful bursts. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, sometimes still, sometimes with eyes wide open and staring directly at me. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and sat at my desk, sketching what I'd seen with obsessive detail. By dawn, my trash can overflowed with crumpled attempts, none capturing the uncanny realism of what I'd encountered. I skipped school the next day, claiming illness. My mother, still worried, didn't argue. She worked from home, checking on me periodically. I spent the hours researching online, searching for anything similar to what I'd experienced. Archaeological discoveries, art installations, optical illusions, nothing matched the visceral reality of what I'd found. By afternoon, I'd convinced myself that returning with my mother would validate my experience. The face would still be there, and an adult would witness it, making it real beyond my own perception. As the time approached to head into the woods, anxiety knotted my stomach. Part of me feared finding nothing, making me question my sanity. But a deeper fear lurked beneath. The dread of finding the face again, of watching my mother touch it and seeing the horror I felt reflected in her eyes. At 5:30 p.m., my mother and I stood at the edge of the woods. The rain had stopped, but the ground remained soggy, mud sucking at our boots. Mom had brought a small garden trowel and flashlight, though the daylight would last for at least another hour. "Lead the way," she said, her tone gentle but tinged with the same voice she used when checking for monsters under my bed when I was 6. The woods felt different, hostile somehow, as if resentful of my return with another person. Trees that had always seemed welcoming now loomed ominously, their branches reaching toward us like gnarled fingers. I navigated carefully, trying to recreate my path from the previous day. Everything looked both familiar and strangely altered, landmarks shifted or obscured by shadows. "It was near the fallen oak," I said, more to myself than to my mother. There was a patch of orange mushrooms nearby. After 15 minutes of increasingly frustrated searching, we found the clearing with the toppled tree. The orange mushrooms were there, just as I remembered. My heartbeat accelerated as I approached the area where the face should have been. Nothing. Just ordinary forest floor, leaves, twigs, patches of moss, and loose soil. No face, no impression, no sign that anything unusual had ever been there. "This is the spot," I insisted, dropping to my knees and beginning to brush aside leaves frantically. "It was right here. I swear it was right here." My mother stood silent, watching my desperate search. Finally, she knelt beside me and put a hand on my shoulder. "The ground is very wet from the rain. Maybe whatever you saw got washed away or covered by runoff." I shook my head violently. "That's not possible. It was like integrated into the ground. Part of it." I looked up at her, pleading. "I'm not making this up." She handed me the trowel. "Let's dig a bit. Maybe there's something underneath." For the next 30 minutes, we excavated the area, first carefully, then with increasing desperation on my part. We found nothing but normal forest soil, roots, and the occasional earthworm. No evidence of anything unusual, certainly nothing resembling human remains or an art installation. As daylight began to fade, my mother gently suggested we head home. "Sometimes our minds play tricks on us," she offered, "especially in places like forests where the lighting can be tricky and there are lots of organic shapes that can look like other things." I wanted to argue, to insist on the reality of what I'd experienced, but the evidence, or lack thereof, made my position increasingly untenable. Had I hallucinated the entire thing? Was I having some kind of breakdown? Reluctantly, I followed her home, glancing back repeatedly at the unremarkable patch of ground that had upended my sense of reality. That night, dinner was even more strained than the previous evening. My mother tried to lighten the mood, suggesting that stress from school was getting to me and offering to schedule an appointment with Dr. Rivera, our family physician. "I'm not sick," I insisted, "and I'm not crazy." "I never said you were," she replied, but her eyes told a different story, concern mixed with something else. Worry about my mental state. After dinner, I retreated to my room, avoiding the stack of sketches I'd made. Instead, I pulled out my laptop and fell into a research hole, reading about pareidolia, the tendency to see faces in random objects, and various stress-induced hallucinations. None of the explanations satisfied me. They couldn't account for the tactile sensation of warm flesh, the movement of features. Whatever I'd encountered had been real. The question was, what exactly was it and why had it disappeared? I fell asleep still searching for answers, my laptop open beside me, screen illuminating my troubled face in the darkness. Days passed, melting into weeks. On the surface, I returned to normal routines, attending school, doing homework, maintaining the facade of ordinary teenage life. But internally, I remained fixated on what I'd experienced in the woods. I stopped taking my daily walks, both yearning for and dreading the forest. Instead, I channeled my obsession into research, staying late at the school library to access databases my home internet couldn't reach. I scoured archaeological journals for mentions of strange ground formations, studied geological phenomena that might explain what I'd seen, even delved into local history for stories of similar encounters. My grades began to suffer. Teachers emailed my mother about my declining participation and incomplete assignments. Friends, the few I had, stopped inviting me to weekend gatherings after I repeatedly declined, too consumed by my research to socialize. My mother watched me with increasing concern. I overheard her on the phone one night, speaking in hushed tones to my aunt. "I'm worried about him. Ever since that day in the woods, he's different. Obsessed with this face he thinks he saw. Should I take him to someone? A therapist, maybe?" The suggestion that I needed psychological help rankled, but I understood her perspective. Without evidence, my experience sounded delusional. Sometimes, in moments of clarity, I questioned my own memory. Maybe it had been a vivid hallucination triggered by stress or exhaustion. But then the dreams began. They always started the same way, me walking in the woods, following my familiar path. But instead of one face, the entire forest floor became a mosaic of faces. Hundreds of them, all with eyes closed, all breathing in unison, the ground itself rising and falling like a sleeping giant's chest. In the dream, I would kneel to touch one, and all the eyes would open simultaneously, fixing me with the same penetrating stare. I started avoiding sleep, staying up until exhaustion claimed me, then waking drenched in sweat, the echo of those watching eyes lingering in my consciousness. By the third week, I had filled 2 notebooks with theories and questions. The most compelling involved a phenomenon called earth art, installations where artists create sculptures integrated with natural landscapes. But even this explanation fell short. No artist could create something with the organic warmth and movement I'd experienced. My mother's patience wore thin as my obsession deepened. One evening, after finding me asleep amid a scattered array of printouts about geological anomalies, she confronted me directly. "This has gone far enough," she said, gathering my research papers. "You need to let this go. Whatever you think you saw, face or not, it's consuming you." "I can't just forget it," I protested, reaching for my notes. "You can, and you will," she replied firmly. "I'm calling Dr. Rivera tomorrow, and I want you to talk to someone professional about this fixation." That night, I lay awake, staring at my ceiling, torn between anger at not being believed and fear that perhaps I truly was losing my grip on reality. What if there was nothing in those woods? What if my mind had manufactured the entire experience? But as dawn approached and exhaustion finally pulled me towards sleep, a new and terrifying thought surfaced. What if the face was real, but had deliberately disappeared when I brought my mother? What if it wanted only me to see it? And what if it was waiting for me to return alone? 37 days after my initial encounter, I forced myself to return to the woods. My mother, believing my obsession had finally subsided after 2 sessions with a therapist, during which I carefully avoided mentioning the face, instead discussing general school stress, had relaxed her vigilance. The forest welcomed me with familiar scents of decomposing leaves and damp earth. Spring had fully arrived, carpeting the ground with new growth and shifting the quality of light as it filtered through fresh green canopy. I deliberately avoided the fallen oak, instead taking a different path that looped around the western edge of the woods. My senses remained hyper-alert, scanning the ground for anything unusual, my body tense with anticipation and dread. Nothing seemed amiss until I reached a small stream that divided the property, little more than a trickle most times of year, swollen slightly from recent rains. As I prepared to step across using the familiar stone crossing, something in the water caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just ripples distorting my reflection. But as I stared more intently, the water seemed to organize itself into a pattern that unmistakably resembled human features: eyes, nose, mouth, formed by the way light played across the surface and the arrangement of pebbles beneath. Coincidence, I whispered to myself. Pareidolia. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the water face seemed to gain definition, becoming more distinct rather than dissolving under scrutiny. And like the earth face before it, this watery visage possessed an impossible level of detail. The subtle curve of lips, the precise shape of nostrils, even the suggestion of eyelashes where water rippled against the bank. My heart hammered as I crouched for a closer look. Unlike the previous face, this one's eyes were open, not staring at me but gazing skyward, the pupils formed by particularly dark pebbles beneath the surface. Fighting against every instinct urging retreat, I reached toward the water, wondering if this apparition would also possess impossible physical properties. The moment my fingertips broke the surface, the face dissolved, water ripples destroying the perfect arrangement. But something brushed against my hand, Not the expected cold current, but something soft and warm that seemed to recede from my touch. I yanked my hand back, water droplets flying. For several minutes I stared at the stream, but the face didn't reform. Just ordinary water flowing over ordinary stones. Backing away from the stream, I surveyed my surroundings with new awareness. The woods suddenly seemed alive in a way that transcended normal forest vitality. The patterns of bark on nearby trees, the arrangement of branches against the sky, the distribution of moss across fallen logs, all seemed deliberately organized, containing half-formed suggestions of faces that appeared and disappeared depending on the angle of observation. I spent hours documenting everything in my notebook, sketching patterns, recording locations. A hypothesis began to form, not about buried bodies or art installations, but something far more disturbing. The forest itself was generating these faces, as if the entire ecosystem were somehow conscious and attempting communication through familiar human patterns. The sun began to set as I made my final notes. As darkness descended, the forest's threatening aura intensified. Shadows deepened between trees, and ordinary night sounds, the rustle of nocturnal animals, the distant hoot of owls, took on sinister overtones. Making my way back toward home, I passed the fallen oak. Despite my earlier avoidance, some compulsion drew me to check the spot where I'd originally found the face. The area remained unremarkable in the fading light. Just soil and leaf litter. But as I turned to leave, the ground behind me released a soft exhalation, like a long-held breath finally released. I ran the rest of the way home. My therapist calls it a controlled exposure, returning to the source of trauma as a way of processing and moving beyond it. But there was nothing controlled about my decision to spend the night in the woods 53 days after my initial encounter. I told my mother I was staying at a friend's house to work on a school project. She seemed pleased by this sign of normalcy, this evidence that I was reconnecting with peers and focusing on academics again. The lie tasted bitter, but necessary. I packed carefully: flashlight, extra batteries, water, protein bars, sleeping bag, first aid kit. And my phone, fully charged, camera function easily accessible. This time, I would document everything. Twilight was fading into true darkness as I reached the woods. Setting up my small camp near, but not too near, the fallen oak, I prepared for a long night of observation. The forest seemed to acknowledge my presence with subtle shifts in its ambient sounds. Birds falling silent, insects intensifying their chorus, branches creaking despite the absence of wind. Hours passed. I alternated between scanning my surroundings and documenting my observations in a new notebook. Occasionally, I thought I glimpsed movement at the periphery of my vision, shadows that moved independently, arrangements of leaves that momentarily formed recognizable patterns before dissolving back into random natural debris. Around midnight, exhaustion began to claim me despite my determination to remain alert. My notes became disjointed, thoughts trailing off mid-sentence as my eyelids grew heavy. I must have dozed because the sound that jolted me awake, a wet, disturbing noise like mud being slowly displaced, seemed to come from everywhere at once. Opening my eyes, I found myself in absolute darkness. My flashlight, which I'd left on, lay dark beside me. Fumbling with the switch produced nothing. Dead batteries? Impossible. They were brand new. My phone showed the same problem, fully charged when I'd last checked, now completely unresponsive. The noise continued, growing louder, a rhythmic squelching that reminded me horribly of a mouth opening and closing in thick mud. It seemed to surround my small camp, coming from all directions simultaneously. Rising to my knees, I strained to see anything in the heavy darkness. The moon provided minimal illumination through the canopy, just enough to distinguish the silhouettes of trees against the marginally lighter sky. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly small. "Is someone there?" The squelching sound stopped immediately. The ensuing silence was more terrifying than the noise had been, a listening silence, attentive and evaluating. Then the ground beneath my sleeping bag shifted. Not like an earthquake or natural settlement, more like something large turning over beneath the surface. My entire body tensed as I felt the earth rise slightly beneath me, forming subtle contours that pressed against my legs and back. I scrambled off my sleeping bag, heart threatening to burst from my chest. Using what little moonlight filtered through the leaves, I could see that the ground where I had been lying was changing, the surface rippling and organizing itself into unmistakable patterns. Faces. Dozens of them. Not just one isolated visage like before, but an entire section of forest floor transforming into a mosaic of human features. Men, women, various ages and expressions, all rendered in perfect detail despite being formed from nothing but soil and leaf litter. Their eyes remained closed, but their mouths moved in silent unison, opening and closing with those terrible wet sounds I'd heard earlier. Some turned their heads slightly, adjusting their positions as if seeking comfort beneath the surface. I stood frozen, unable to run, unable even to scream. My brain struggled to process what my eyes were witnessing, an impossibility made horrifyingly real. Then as one, all the eyes opened. Dozens of gazes fixed on me, pupils contracting in the dim light just as human eyes would. Some blinked, others stared unwaveringly. All possessed the same unsettling awareness, the same terrible intelligence. One face, positioned directly where my sleeping bag had been, spoke. Not in words exactly, but its mouth formed shapes that somehow translated into meaning in my mind. "We have been waiting for you to return." The voice wasn't audible in the conventional sense. Rather, it resonated directly in my thoughts, bypassing my ears entirely. The sensation was invasive, intimate in a way that felt deeply violating. "What are you?" I managed to whisper. The faces shifted, some smiling slightly, others maintaining neutral expressions. The one that had spoken replied, "We are the foundation, the witness, the memory." "Human?" I asked, though I already knew the answer was both yes and no. "Once," came the reply. "Now part of something greater." Other faces began to speak, their thought voices overlapping in my mind, creating a dizzying chorus of communication. Images flashed through my consciousness, centuries of forest history compressed into seconds, generations of humans who had walked these grounds, lives and deaths witnessed by the patient earth. I glimpsed terrible knowledge in those mental transmissions, hints of what happened to those who became one with this strange consciousness. The slow dissolution of individual identity as they merged with the greater awareness that permeated the soil. Most disturbing were the glimpses of how new faces joined this collective, not through death alone, but through a gradual claiming, a persistent invitation extended to those the forest deemed receptive. Those like me, who walked alone among the trees, who felt more connection to nature than to human society. "You called to us," one face said, its features remarkably similar to my own. "Your solitude, your longing, we answered." The ground around me continued to transform, more faces emerging, the circle closing. I realized with horror that they were creating a space for me, a me-shaped depression in the earth where I would fit perfectly. "Join us," they intoned in unison. "Become foundation, become witness, become memory." The earth beneath my feet softened, beginning to pull at my boots like quicksand. Panic exploded through me, breaking the paralysis that had gripped me during this impossible exchange. I ran, feet tearing free from the grasping soil with sickening suction sounds. Behind me, a chorus of disappointed sighs rose from dozens of earthen throats. Branches whipped my face as I fled blindly through darkness, the path invisible, direction meaningless. Just away, away from those watching eyes and beckoning voices. Several times I fell, each contact with the ground bringing renewed terror that the soil would form around me, claim me. Somehow, I found the edge of the woods. Moonlight revealed the welcome sight of houses beyond the tree line. Safety, normality. Human spaces where earth stayed inanimate and soil didn't speak with borrowed faces. As I crossed that boundary, my phone suddenly chimed to life in my pocket, battery miraculous restored to full power. Notifications cascaded across the screen, missed calls from my mother, messages asking where I was, why I wasn't answering. Looking back at the dark mass of trees, I saw nothing pursuing me, just an ordinary forest on an ordinary night. But I knew what waited within, patient and persistent, what would always be waiting. And I knew, with sickening certainty, that part of me wanted to return. 3 months have passed since that night. I've moved through summer in a daze, going through the motions of normal life while carrying the weight of what I know, what I've seen and heard and felt. My mother worries less now. The therapist has officially diagnosed me with an anxiety disorder with transient stress-induced perceptual abnormalities. The medication they prescribed doesn't change what I know to be true, but it dulls the constant fear enough that I can function, can pretend to be the person I was before. I haven't returned to the woods, not physically. But in dreams, I walk beneath those trees nightly, discovering new faces in streams, tree bark, arrangements of fallen leaves. Sometimes I wake convinced that my bedroom floor is shifting beneath my bed, organizing itself into watching eyes and listening mouths. The compulsion to return grows stronger each day. An ache like homesickness, though what calls to me isn't home but its opposite. Dissolution, surrendering my discrete self to become part of something vast and ancient. I've researched obsessively, searching for similar accounts throughout history. I've found fragments, myths of earth deities who claim humans, folklore about forests that consume travelers, modern disappearances in wooded areas that were never solved. The pattern seems clear now. Certain places develop a consciousness over time, an awareness that spreads through soil and root systems, that remembers and learns and eventually desires communion with the human minds that move through its domain. And once it notices you, once it recognizes your receptiveness, it never stops calling. I've taken to wearing headphones constantly, filling my ears with music or podcasts or audiobooks, anything to drown out the whispers that seem to emanate from houseplants, from the small patch of garden outside my window, from the very ground beneath the concrete foundations of our house. At night, I stuff towels along the bottom of my bedroom door to prevent soil from seeping in, a precaution my mother attributes to my contamination anxiety, but which I know is necessary. Twice I've woken to find dirt on my bedroom carpet, arranged in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. Last week I found a small face forming in my mother's garden, just the suggestion of features pressing up through the tomato bed, but unmistakable to my trained eye. I destroyed it with a garden trowel before she could see it, digging until my hands blistered and the soil showed no further signs of organization. It's following me, reaching for me, patient but persistent. Sometimes I wonder if resistance is merely postponing the inevitable. The faces in the woods spoke of witnesses and memory, of foundations and greater purpose. What if they weren't threatening me but offering transcendence? What if what waits in the soil isn't death but transformation? These thoughts terrify me most of all because they don't feel entirely like my own. They carry echoes of those thought voices that invaded my mind that night, subtle persuasion masquerading as insight. I've started recording everything, writing this account, documenting each new manifestation, creating a record that might survive whatever happens to me, because I'm increasingly certain that something will happen. The most recent development occurred yesterday. While brushing my teeth, I noticed something strange about my reflection. For just a moment, barely a second, my skin took on the texture and coloration of soil, my features resembling those earth faces from the woods. The impression vanished when I blinked, but the message was clear. The process has already begun. The forest has marked me, claimed me in some fundamental way that transcends physical proximity. Tonight, I'll reinforce my windows and doors with salt lines. A superstition, perhaps, but I'm beyond dismissing folklore as mere fantasy. I'll continue my medication, continue therapy, continue pretending that conventional treatment can address what ails me. But I know the truth, even if no one else will ever believe it. The earth is awake. It watches. It remembers. It waits. And somewhere in those woods, a space exactly my size and shape remains prepared, ready to receive me when my resistance finally breaks. A place where I will join countless others, becoming foundation, witness, memory. Another face in the earth, watching through the ages as new solitary walkers pass overhead, unaware of what stirs beneath their feet. Until one day, one of them steps exactly right, feels the giving warmth beneath their soul, and begins their own journey to understanding what waits beneath the surface of our world. I wonder if I'll still be me when that happens. Or if I'll be part of the chorus that calls to them, invites them, welcomes them home. I lived in rural Florida about 10 years ago when I was 17. Our house sat on roughly 1.6 acres of property, bordered by dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly behind our home. Back then, we lived on a narrow gravel road with just one streetlight positioned halfway up from our house. The isolation was both peaceful and unsettling, especially after sunset. Our neighborhood, if you could call it that, consisted of only 6 scattered houses. From our property, we could only see our immediate neighbors. About 500 feet up the road stood a small cabin where family friends lived as renters. The location perfectly captures that distinctly southern rural isolation, close enough to civilization to not feel completely cut off, but remote enough that help wasn't just a quick minute away. Growing up, I had always been fascinated by the paranormal. While other teenagers obsessed over sports or music, I spent countless hours researching unexplained phenomena and reading accounts of strange encounters. My mother's spiritual practices only intensified my curiosity. She practiced paganism and various forms of protective rituals. The good kind, she would always clarify whenever anyone asked. Her beliefs were rooted in protection and harmony with nature, though I never fully understood the extent of her practices until later. Our property had an unusual energy about it. The towering pines that surrounded our clearing seemed to hold secrets in their shadows, and the forest floor, carpeted with fallen needles and dried leaves, muffled sounds in a way that made the woods feel unnaturally quiet at times. During the day, these woods were my playground. By night, they transformed into something else entirely. That particular evening began like many others. It was early autumn, and the Florida heat had finally started to subside, giving way to pleasantly cool evenings. My parents, 2 older siblings, and several relatives had gathered at the cabin up the road for one of their regular get-togethers. The sounds of laughter and music drifted down to our house, muted by distance and the absorption of the surrounding trees. I stayed behind with my younger sister, who had fallen asleep on the couch while watching a movie. The living room was bathed in the flickering blue light of the television, casting strange, elongated shadows across the walls. The clock on the wall read just after 7 p.m., and darkness had fully descended outside our windows. While my sister slept, I felt restless. The house seemed too quiet, too confining. Maybe it was teenage boredom or perhaps some unconscious intuition, but something compelled me to step outside into the cool night air. I remember telling myself I was just letting our dog out to relieve himself, though in retrospect I think I was drawn outside by something I couldn't quite articulate. As I stood on our back porch, the familiar silhouettes of trees against the night sky should have been comforting. Instead, they seemed to shift and move in ways they shouldn't have. The darkness between them appeared deeper, more absolute than usual. Something felt off, though I couldn't place exactly what had changed. Little did I understand that night would permanently alter my perception of the woods I'd grown up exploring. What I encountered would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world and leave me questioning whether some things are better left uninvestigated. Standing on the edge of our property, I gazed into the darkness beyond our yard. The night was unusually still. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves. Even the distant music from the cabin seemed to have momentarily paused, leaving behind a vacuum of sound that pressed against my eardrums. That's when I heard it. Movement in the woods near our bonfire clearing, about 100 feet from where I stood. The bonfire area was a spot our family used for gatherings, a circular clearing surrounded by tall pines where we'd set up chairs and roast marshmallows on weekend evenings. At first, I dismissed the sounds as wildlife. Growing up in rural Florida meant coexisting with various animals, raccoons, foxes, coyotes, and the occasional wildcat. But this sound was different. The footfalls were heavier, more deliberate than any local wildlife. Whatever moved through those woods had significant weight to it, pressing dried pine needles into the earth with each step. My instincts immediately signaled danger. The rational part of my brain tried to catalog possibilities. A large dog, perhaps, or maybe a neighbor trespassing. But we were far from any walking path, and our neighbors rarely ventured into these woods, especially after dark. The movement continued, branches snapping under substantial weight. I backed toward the corner of our house, keeping my eyes fixed on the tree line. That's when I saw them. 2 pale, luminous discs floating about 6 feet above the ground at the forest's edge. They resembled eyes but were too perfectly round, too intensely bright to belong to any animal I recognized. Those eyes, if that's what they were, seemed to emit their own light rather than reflect it. They hung in the darkness like twin moons, unblinking and fixed directly on me. Despite the distance, I felt their gaze penetrating through me, studying me with cold intelligence. For several excruciating seconds, we remained locked in this standoff, me frozen in place, the entity motionless at the tree line. The boundary where our cleared property met the woods seemed to function as some invisible barrier. The thing, whatever it was, remained just beyond that threshold, as though physically unable to cross onto our land. Then it spoke. The sound that emerged from the darkness defied natural acoustics. It was simultaneously distant and right beside my ear, hollow yet resonant, like someone speaking through an old metal pipe. The voice was rough and strained, as though forcing sound through an anatomy not designed for human speech. "I see you," it said, the words unnaturally elongated. Hearing my name spoken by that voice triggered something primal inside me. Every cell in my body screamed to run, yet I remained paralyzed by fear, my muscles locked in place. "Come here," it continued, its tone shifting to something almost persuasive. "I don't want to hurt you." Its reassurance accomplished precisely the opposite of what it intended. The unnatural quality of its voice, that grating metallic resonance, made each word feel like a physical threat. Though it remained at the tree line, I sensed its growing impatience, its desire to close the distance between us. "Here," it repeated, sharper this time, more command than invitation. The realization that this entity couldn't, or wouldn't, cross onto our property finally broke my paralysis. A rush of adrenaline flooded my system, briefly overwhelming my terror with youthful indignation. In that moment of misplaced courage, I committed what could have been a deadly mistake. I grabbed a rock from the ground about half the size of my fist and hurled it toward those glowing eyes. "Get out of here!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear despite my attempt at bravery. In the darkness, I couldn't see if my projectile found its mark. But the response was immediate and terrifying. A piercing screech erupted from the tree line, a sound so unnaturally loud and high-pitched that it seemed to vibrate the air itself. Then, impossibly, the rock I had thrown moments before whizzed past my head, missing me by mere inches before disappearing into the woods behind our house. The force behind that return throw was nothing human. No person could have hurled that rock with such velocity, such precision in complete darkness. Whatever stood watching me from the tree line wasn't just trespassing. It was something I couldn't begin to comprehend. I ran for the front door, fumbling with the handle before practically falling inside. My sister had awakened, rubbing her eyes sleepily from her place on the couch. "What's wrong?" she mumbled, still half asleep. "Nothing," I managed, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "Just thought I heard something." I retreated to my bedroom, drew the curtains tight, and huddled under my blankets, listening intently for any sound that might indicate it had followed me to the house. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I struggled to hear anything else. All I could do was wait for my family to return, hoping the night would pass without further incident. The hours crept by with excruciating slowness. Every creak of the house settling, every whisper of wind against the windows amplified my terror. I remained hidden beneath my covers, phone clutched in my sweating palm, debating whether to call my parents. Pride and embarrassment held me back. What would I say? That something with glowing eyes had spoken my name from the woods? That it had caught and returned my thrown rock with impossible force? Even as I experienced it, the encounter seemed too outlandish to be believed. Eventually, the sounds of vehicles on our gravel driveway announced my family's return. The relief that flooded through me was nearly overwhelming. I emerged from my room on unsteady legs to find my mother in the kitchen, putting away leftovers from the gathering. Without explanation, I wrapped my arms around her and held tight. "Thank you," I whispered, "for protecting the family." She pulled back, studying my face with concern. "What do you mean? What happened?" "I don't want to talk about it," I replied, summoning a small smile. "Just, thank you." That night marked the beginning of my insomnia. Sleep refused to come as I lay staring at my ceiling, ears straining for any sound from outside. The rational part of my brain tried to explain away my experience. Maybe it was a hunter with a flashlight, perhaps the returned rock was simply my imagination. But I knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever I had encountered was neither natural nor easily explained. The next morning, I ventured cautiously to the spot where I'd thrown the rock. Daylight transformed the woods into something mundane and familiar, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The bonfire clearing showed no obvious signs of disturbance, no footprints or evidence of what I'd seen. This absence of proof only deepened my unease. If there were no traces, how could I convince myself or anyone else of what had happened? Over the following days, I developed new habits. I refused to go outside after sunset. My bedroom windows remained locked and curtained regardless of the stifling Florida heat. I invented excuses to avoid family campfires and outdoor gatherings. My parents attributed my behavioral changes to typical teenage moodiness, but my mother watched me with knowing eyes, sensing something had fundamentally shifted. A week passed without incident, and I began to wonder if that night had been some vivid hallucination, until the dreams began. Each night, I found myself standing at the edge of our property, facing those same luminous eyes in the darkness. In these dreams, the invisible barrier didn't hold. The entity would step into the clearing, its form remaining frustratingly indistinct except for those eyes and a silhouette that seemed almost but not quite human. "You threw something at me," it would say in that same unnatural voice. "Now, I'll throw something at you." I would always wake just as it raised its arm to throw, gasping and drenched in sweat, convinced I could smell pine needles and damp earth in my bedroom. My academic performance suffered as exhaustion took its toll. Dark circles appeared beneath my eyes, and my once healthy appetite disappeared. My mother finally confronted me one evening, sitting on the edge of my bed with an expression of such genuine concern that my carefully constructed defenses crumbled. "Something's out there," I whispered, the admission bringing both relief and renewed terror. "In the woods. It knows my name." Instead of dismissing my fears or offering platitudes, my mother's expression darkened with recognition. She took my hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "Tell me everything," she said. "Don't leave anything out." My mother listened without interruption as I described my encounter in detail. The unnatural movement, the glowing eyes, the impossible voice, and the returned rock. When I finished, she didn't question my sanity or offer rational explanations. Instead, she nodded slowly, her eyes focused on something distant. "The property has always been protected," she said finally. "My rituals ensure that." Her confirmation of supernatural protection should have been comforting, but it only raised more questions. If our land was protected, what exactly was being kept at bay? And why was it targeting me specifically? Mom rose and went to her closet, returning with a worn, leather-bound book I'd never seen before. The spine was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and fragile as she carefully opened it. "Our family has lived with these woods for generations," she explained. "What you encountered isn't new to this land." She turned the book toward me. On the page was a detailed hand-drawn illustration dated 1932, depicting a tall, gaunt figure standing among trees. Its eyes were rendered as empty circles, giving it an unsettling, hollow appearance. The accompanying text described the Watcher in the Woods that had stalked the property's borders for as long as anyone could remember. "Your great-grandmother first documented it," Mom continued. "Every few decades, it becomes more active, testing boundaries, seeking ways to cross onto protected ground. According to family records, the entity never managed to claim anyone from our bloodline, though there were accounts of missing travelers and hunters who ventured too deep into the surrounding forest. The local indigenous people had apparently warned early settlers about the area, advising them to perform specific rituals before building homes. Those who heeded the warnings thrived. Those who dismissed them often abandoned their properties after experiencing phenomena similar to what I'd witnessed. "But why now?" I asked. "Why me?" My mother's expression grew troubled. "It's drawn to certain qualities: curiosity, emotional intensity, the threshold between childhood and adulthood. You're exactly the kind of person it finds interesting." She explained that my research into the paranormal might have inadvertently attuned me to forces most people remain blissfully unaware of. By seeking knowledge of the unknown, I had potentially made myself visible to it. "What exactly is it?" I pressed, needing to understand the threat I faced. My mother chose her words carefully. "The settlers called it many things: watcher, stalker, collector of souls. The indigenous people had their own name for it that roughly translates to the hungry one. But names have power, and it's dangerous to speak of such things too directly." She closed the book. "What matters is understanding how to stay protected. You challenged it, drew its attention more fully to you. Now we need to strengthen our defenses." That night, my mother taught me the protective rituals that had been passed down through generations of our family. We burned specific herbs, spoke ancient words in languages I didn't recognize, and placed symbolic objects at crucial points around our property. The ritual felt simultaneously primitive and profound, connecting me to ancestors who had faced the same entity centuries before. As we worked, my mother revealed more family history. Stories of close calls, of relatives who had glimpsed the entity during particularly vulnerable moments in their lives. Some had heard it mimic loved ones' voices to lure them into the woods. Others had found strange arrangements of sticks and stones on the property boundaries, apparent attempts to disrupt the protective barriers. "Remember," my mother cautioned, "it can't enter our land uninvited. It can't cross the threshold unless welcomed. But it's patient and clever, and it will use your fears and weaknesses against you." As we completed the final elements of the ritual near the tree line, I felt the weight of countless generations who had performed these same actions to keep their families safe. For the first time since my encounter, I felt a measure of control returning. Not enough to eliminate my fear, but sufficient to face another night with something resembling courage. "Will this stop the dreams?" I asked as we gathered our supplies. My mother's hesitation told me everything before she answered. "The dreams are its attempt to reach you through means that don't require physical crossing. Your mind remains your own territory to defend." That night, exhaustion finally overcame fear, and I fell into deep sleep. The entity visited my dreams as expected, but something had changed. The barrier between us remained intact, and I sensed frustration emanating from those glowing eyes as they watched me from the darkness. "Your mother can't protect you forever," it said, its voice somehow clearer in the dreamscape. "Eventually, you'll come to me." For the first time, I found my voice in the dream. "Never." The eyes narrowed, and I detected something new in its demeanor, respect perhaps, or reassessment. It hadn't expected resistance. Before the dream faded, I heard its final words. "We have time. I've waited for generations. I can wait for you." 2 weeks passed with relative calm. The dreams continued but lost their terrifying edge as I learned to recognize them as battlegrounds rather than helpless nightmares. During daylight hours, I could almost convince myself the entire experience had been exaggerated by an overactive imagination. Almost. Then came the gifts. The first appeared on our front porch one morning, a precisely arranged collection of small animal bones forming an intricate pattern. My father dismissed it as the work of local kids playing pranks, sweeping the bones away before I could examine them closely. But I recognized the deliberate placement, the unnatural symmetry that no child could have achieved. 3 days later, I found a dead fox placed at the exact spot where I had stood during my initial encounter. Its body was unmarked, showing no wounds or signs of predation, yet its eyes had been removed with surgical precision. The discovery sent me retching into the bushes while my older brother disposed of the carcass. "This isn't funny anymore," he told my parents that evening. "Someone's targeting our house." They called the sheriff, who dutifully took notes and promised to increase patrols on our road. But I knew law enforcement couldn't protect us from what lurked in those woods. The entity was escalating, growing more bold in its attempts to provoke a response, specifically from me. The following weekend, my parents insisted I accompany them to a neighbor's gathering, hoping to break my self-imposed isolation. I reluctantly agreed, finding temporary comfort in daylight and the company of others. As afternoon faded into evening, however, my anxiety mounted. By sunset, I was visibly agitated, checking my watch and suggesting we leave before darkness fully descended. My mother recognized my distress and made excuses to our hosts. As we walked toward our car, I felt eyes on me. Not the supernatural gaze from the woods, but human observation. A neighbor's son, about 20 years old, approached me while my parents chatted with other adults. "You're the kid who's been seeing things in the woods, right?" he asked without preamble. My surprise must have shown on my face because he quickly added, "Word gets around. My grandfather used to talk about something similar when I was younger." Against my better judgment, I found myself asking, "What did he say about it?" The young man, whose name was apparently forbidden to mention, glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. He called it the collector, said it gathered things that interested it, sometimes objects, sometimes animals, sometimes people. A chill washed over me despite the warm evening air. "My grandfather claimed he encountered it when he was about your age," he continued. "Said it spoke to him, tried to convince him to walk into the woods at night. He refused, but his friend didn't." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "They never found his friend." "That's just a local legend," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He shrugged. "Maybe. But grandfather never went into those woods again, not even during hunting season. and he made us promise the same. As we drove home in the gathering darkness, I couldn't shake the young man's words. The possibility that others had encountered the entity both validated my experience and deepened my dread. If the stories were true, this thing had been hunting in these woods for generations, and sometimes successfully. That night, I lay awake long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring at my ceiling and listening. Around 2 a.m., a soft tapping began at my window, gentle, rhythmic, almost polite. I knew without looking what would be there. The curtains remained closed, but in my mind's eye I could see those luminous orbs floating outside the glass. The tapping continued for nearly an hour, occasionally interspersed with the sound of my name being called in that horribly familiar voice. Eventually, it stopped, replaced by silence so absolute it seemed to have weight. I must have drifted off because I woke suddenly to find myself standing in our front yard, the cool grass beneath my bare feet. Moonlight illuminated the clearing enough to see that I was mere steps from the tree line. Ahead, just within the shadows of the forest, those pale eyes watched me. With horror, I realized I had sleepwalked dangerously close to crossing the boundary. The entity had nearly succeeded in luring me beyond protection while my conscious defenses were lowered. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on those glowing orbs until I reached our front door. Inside, I woke my mother in a panic, explaining what had happened. Her face paled as she realized the entity had found a new strategy. If it couldn't cross onto our property, it would try to draw me off it. "We need to take more drastic measures," she decided, her voice tight with concern. "This has gone beyond simple boundary protections." My mother spent the following day gathering supplies and consulting her books. That evening she informed the family we would be performing a more powerful ritual, one specifically designed to reveal what we faced so we could defend against it more effectively. "Knowledge is power," she explained as we gathered in the living room. "If we can see it clearly, understand what draws it to us, we gain advantage." My father, always supportive of my mother's practices despite his own skepticism, helped arrange candles in a specific pattern. My siblings looked uneasy, but participated without complaint. They had witnessed enough strange occurrences recently to take the threat seriously. As darkness fell, we began the ritual. My mother burned herbs that filled the house with sweet, earthy smoke. She spoke words in that same ancient language, her voice growing stronger with each phrase. The atmosphere in the room changed subtly. The air felt thicker, charged with potential. "Now," she instructed me, "think about your encounters. Recall every detail, the sounds, the sensations, the exact words it spoke to you." I closed my eyes and concentrated, mentally revisiting each interaction with the entity. As the memories surfaced, the candle flame suddenly stretched upward, burning with unusual intensity. "It's responding," my mother whispered. "It feels our attention." A low humming vibration filled the room, making the windows rattle slightly in their frames. The temperature dropped noticeably, our breath becoming visible in the suddenly chilled air. "What's happening?" my father asked, his customary calm faltering. My mother's expression was one of fierce concentration. "We're pulling back the veil, seeing through its disguise." The smoke from the herbs began swirling unnaturally, condensing into a vaguely humanoid shape in the center of our circle. Within this smoky silhouette, 2 points of light appeared, those same pale, luminous discs that had watched me from the woods. "Why have you come to this family?" my mother demanded, her voice commanding. The smoke figure wavered, and that now familiar voice emerged, but clearer, less strained than I had heard before. "I have always been here," it replied, "long before your family, before any settlers. This land remembers me." "What do you want with my child?" my mother pressed. The smoke shifted, those glowing eyes turning directly toward me. "Potential, curiosity, youth, things I have lost." A sudden realization hit me. This entity wasn't necessarily malevolent in the way I had imagined. It was ancient, alienating, frightening in its otherness, but its interest in me wasn't simply predatory. It was drawn to qualities I possessed that it recognized or perhaps coveted. "Are you human?" I found myself asking. "Were you ever human?" The smoke rippled, almost like laughter. "I was, long ago, before time was measured as you measure it." My mother tensed beside me. "A human who became something else," she murmured, "through choice or circumstance." "Choice," the voice confirmed. "Always choice. As your child will have choice." The implication chilled me more deeply than any supernatural encounter. This entity believed I could, or would, become like it someday. That my fascination with the unknown might lead me down a path similar to whatever transformation it had undergone. "I don't want what you're offering," I stated firmly. The smoke figure inclined what passed for its head. "Yet, you don't want it yet, but curiosity grows, questions multiply, ordinary existence dulls. I have watched your kind for centuries. I recognize the signs." My mother stepped forward, placing herself between me and the apparition. "You will not have my child. Not through force, manipulation, or temptation. This family stands protected." The smoke began to dissipate, those glowing eyes dimming slightly. Before it fully vanished, the entity spoke one final time. "Protection doesn't last forever. Generations pass, knowledge fades. I remain." With those words, the smoke scattered, the candles extinguished simultaneously, and the temperature gradually returned to normal. We sat in stunned silence for several moments before my father switched on the lights. "Did we banish it?" my younger sister asked hopefully. My mother's expression was somber. "No, we merely understood it better, and it understood us." That night, for the first time since my initial encounter, I slept without dreaming of glowing eyes or voices from the darkness. But this absence brought no comfort. I sensed the entity had simply changed tactics once again, settling in for a longer game than I had initially realized. The revelation that our unwelcome watcher had once been human transformed my fear into something more complex. Horror remained, certainly, but now accompanied by uncomfortable curiosity. What process could change a person into such an entity? How long had it existed in this in-between state, neither fully human nor supernatural? Most disturbingly, what had it recognized in me that suggested I might follow a similar path? These questions consumed my thoughts in the days following our ritual. I delved deeper into my mother's books, searching for historical accounts that might explain the entity's origins. Among her collection, I discovered a journal dating back to the early 1800s, written by a settler who had originally claimed our land. The journal detailed the writer's encounters with local indigenous people who warned about the area's dangerous history. According to their oral traditions, a medicine man from centuries earlier had sought immortality through forbidden rituals. He achieved his goal, but at terrible cost, becoming untethered from humanity, unable to fully exist in either the physical or spiritual realm. Condemned to haunt the boundaries between worlds, he developed an obsession with those who showed similar spiritual inclinations. The account aligned disturbingly well with our experiences. The entity that watched our property wasn't some ancient evil or mythological creature. It had been a person who made catastrophic choices in pursuit of knowledge beyond natural limits. Armed with this information, I approached my mother. "It's targeting me because it thinks I'm like it was," I explained. "Because I research the supernatural, because I'm drawn to understanding things beyond normal experience." She nodded slowly. "That's what I feared. It recognizes something in your spirit, a kinship or potential for kinship." "How do I convince it it's wrong?" I asked. "How do I make it understand I don't want whatever transformation it underwent?" My mother considered this carefully. "You must confront it directly, not in dreams or through ritual, but at the boundary where it dwells. You must reject its offer explicitly, with absolute conviction." The thought of deliberately seeking another encounter terrified me, but I recognized the necessity. This entity wouldn't simply lose interest or find another target. It had fixated on me specifically, and only direct rejection might dissuade it. We planned the confrontation meticulously. My mother strengthened the protective boundaries around our property and prepared me with specific phrases and gestures that would reinforce my rejection. The confrontation would occur at dawn, a time of transition when the entity might be more visible but less powerful than during full darkness. The appointed morning arrived clear and cool. I stood at the edge of our property as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. My mother waited on the porch, close enough to intervene if necessary, but giving me space to face this challenge alone. As the forest gradually emerged from darkness, I sensed rather than saw the entity's approach. The air grew noticeably colder, and birds that had begun their morning songs suddenly fell silent. Then, at the precise boundary between our cleared land and the woods, the familiar glowing eyes materialized. "I know what you were," I called out, my voice steadier than I expected. "I know what you want from me." The entity moved closer than it had ever ventured before, its form becoming slightly more distinct in the growing light. A tall, emaciated silhouette with disproportionately long limbs and those unnatural eyes. "Then you understand the opportunity," it replied, its voice less distorted than during our previous encounters. "Few are offered such knowledge." "I understand the cost," I countered. "I've read about what you sacrificed. That's not a path I'll ever choose." The entity went still, those luminous eyes narrowing slightly. "You cannot know what you might choose in time. Decades of ordinary existence, the slow decay of body and mind, the limitations of human perception, these burdens grow heavier with age." "They're not burdens," I insisted. "They're what make us human. Connection, change, even mortality. They give life meaning." "Meaning is subjective," it responded. "What meaning remains when everyone you know has returned to dust? When civilizations rise and fall before your eyes? I have witnessed more than you can imagine." "And you've experienced none of it," I said, the realization crystallizing as I spoke. "You watch but cannot participate. That's your punishment. Eternal observation without connection." The entity's form wavered slightly, the first indication I'd struck a nerve. "I reject your interest in me," I continued, emboldened. "I reject any kinship between us. I choose humanity, fully, completely, with all its limitations and endings." "You choose ignorance," it hissed, moving restlessly at the boundary. "I choose life," I corrected. "Real life, not your half-existence." The confrontation continued as the sun climbed higher, the entity becoming less distinct in the growing daylight. Its arguments grew more desperate, alternating between temptation and threats, but I remained resolute. With each rejection, its form seemed to diminish slightly, retreating incrementally toward the deeper shadows. Finally, as full morning light flooded the clearing, it spoke its parting words. "Time will test your conviction. I will be watching when doubt finds you." Then it was gone, leaving only a lingering coldness that gradually dissipated in the warming air. My mother joined me, placing a protective arm around my shoulders. "You did well," she said softly. "But remember its final warning. This isn't a single battle won, but the beginning of vigilance." I nodded, understanding the entity might never fully abandon its interest in me. The connection had been established. I would need to reaffirm my choice periodically throughout my life. 10 years have passed since that confrontation at the edge of our property. My life progressed along predictably human paths. College, career, relationships, all the ordinary triumphs and disappointments that constitute a normal existence. I moved away from that rural Florida house, establishing my own home in a different state, deliberately choosing a place with minimal forest coverage and abundant neighbors. Yet I never completely escaped the Watcher's influence. During particularly vulnerable moments, times of significant loss, periods of existential questioning, I sometimes glimpse those luminous eyes in darkened windows or feel that distinctive coldness brushing against my consciousness. These episodes are brief and increasingly rare, but they serve as reminders that some connections, once formed, never completely dissolve. My mother continues to maintain the protective boundaries around our family home, refreshing the ancient rituals each season. She once confided that previous generations experienced similar targeted interest from the entity, suggesting it cycles through our family line, seeking potential converts every few decades. "Your grandmother faced it in her youth," she told me during a recent visit, "and her grandmother before her, always drawn to the most spiritually sensitive among us." I've maintained a journal documenting my experiences, adding to the family record that stretches back centuries. Future generations should know what watches from the woods, should understand the temptations it offers and the true nature of its existence. Knowledge remains our strongest defense, not the forbidden knowledge it promised, but practical understanding of the threat and its limitations. My research into the paranormal continues, though with greater caution and stronger boundaries. I no longer approach the subject with naive fascination, but with respectful distance. Some mysteries are better appreciated from afar, some thresholds better left uncrossed. Occasionally I wonder about the entity's origins, the human it once was, the choices that transformed it into its current state. In unguarded moments, I find myself speculating about its lonely existence, traversing the boundaries between worlds, watching life unfold but unable to participate. There exists a peculiar tragedy in its condition that occasionally evokes unwelcome sympathy. These moments of empathy concern me most, suggesting the entity correctly identified something in my nature that resembles its former self, a dangerous curiosity that could, under different circumstances, lead down similar paths. The recognition of this potential affinity serves as my most important safeguard, a constant reminder of what I might become if I pursued knowledge without ethical constraints. When I visit my childhood home, I no longer fear the forest that surrounds it. I respect its dangers but understand my power to reject what lurks within. The boundary between our property and those woods represents more than physical separation. It delineates a crucial philosophical choice between participation in human existence, with all its limitations, and the cold observation of immortality without connection. Sometimes, standing at that boundary during daylight hours, I speak aloud to the watcher I know still lingers among the trees. I describe the richness of human experience, the connections formed, the growth achieved, even the poignant beauty of transience. Whether these monologues reach their intended audience, I cannot say, but they reinforce my commitment to the path I've chosen. God alone knows what truly awaits beyond mortal existence. But I've concluded that rushing toward such knowledge through forbidden means creates something neither human nor divine. Just the hollow observer my family has contended with for generations. The entity was right about one thing: time tests conviction. Each passing year brings new questions, new awareness of mortality's approach. Yet these challenges strengthen rather than weaken my resolve. I choose the finite but fully experienced human journey over eternal shadow existence. Those glowing eyes may continue watching from forest edges and darkened corners throughout my life, but they observe someone firmly committed to remaining human, with all the wonder, connection, and yes, eventual ending that entails. In this conscious choice renewed daily, I have found freedom from fear. The watcher remains as it has for centuries, but now serves as a reminder rather than a threat. A stark illustration of what awaits those who seek to transcend humanity through isolation rather than connection, through observation without participation, through endless duration without genuine growth. And so our strange relationship continues, the watcher and the watched, each making fundamentally different choices about what constitutes a meaningful existence. In that philosophical gulf between us lies the essence of what it means to embrace our humanity, limitations and all. My name is Dorian Finch, and in 2017, I took my RV up to the remote corners of Kluane National Park in the Yukon Territory. I figured that after years of crunching numbers as an accountant, a little adventure might do me some good. Always the guy behind the desk, I wanted to be the guy behind the wheel for once. The drive was long but breathtaking. Towering mountains draped in glaciers loomed over dense forests, and the air was so crisp it felt like a tonic. I parked my RV at a secluded spot near a pristine lake, the kind of place you'd see on a postcard. It was just me, the wilderness, and a stack of mystery novels I'd been meaning to read. On the second day, I met a fellow camper named Hank. A grizzled old-timer with a beard that could house a family of birds, he was full of stories about the area. "You picked a heck of a spot, Dorian," he said. "Not many folks come out this far. Keeps the riffraff out." "Well, except for us accountants seeking thrills," I quipped. He chuckled. "Just keep an eye out for the wildlife. Bears around here have a sweet tooth for city folk." We shared a laugh, and he offered me some freshly caught trout before heading back to his campsite. That night, I cooked the fish over a campfire, feeling more content than I had in years. The stars overhead were so bright they seemed to poke holes in the sky. The following morning, I decided to hike a nearby trail Hank had mentioned. It was supposedly an old trading route used by First Nations people, rarely trodden these days. Armed with a map, a compass, and my questionable sense of direction, I set off. The trail started innocently enough. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with patches of gold. Birds called overhead, their songs echoing through the trees. I inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of pine and earth. This was exactly what I'd been craving: pure, unadulterated nature. About an hour into the hike, I stumbled upon something unusual. A series of wooden carvings hanging from the trees. They were intricate, depicting various animals and symbols I didn't recognize. One looked like a wolf intertwined with vines. Another was a raven with outstretched wings. Local art installation? I mused aloud. Banksy, eat your heart out. But as I ventured deeper, the carvings became more frequent and more unsettling. One showed a human figure with antlers surrounded by flames. Another depicted a face with hollow eyes and an open mouth as if screaming. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the northern air. The trail narrowed, hemmed in by dense underbrush. The cheerful birdsong had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I glanced at my watch. I'd been hiking for nearly 2 hours. Perhaps it was time to head back. Deciding it was best to turn around, I pivoted only to hear a rustling in the bushes behind me. Probably just a squirrel on steroids, I told myself, picking up the pace. The rustling grew louder, now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I glanced over my shoulder, but saw nothing. The forest seemed denser than before, the trees pressing in like silent onlookers. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out. No response, just the wind whispering through the branches. I continued walking, my casual stroll now a hurried stride. Then I saw it, a figure darting between the trees. Too large for an animal, too swift for a casual hiker. "Okay, Dorian, time to break that personal best in the 100-meter dash," I muttered. I broke into a jog, then a run. The footsteps behind me quickened. My heart pounded in my chest like a frantic drum solo. In my haste, I tripped over an exposed root and went sprawling onto the ground. "Great, taken down by a tree's toe," I groaned. As I scrambled to my feet, a man emerged from the trees. He was tall and gaunt, wearing tattered clothes stained with dirt. And was that blood? His hair was wild, a tangled mane that framed a face etched with grime and something else. Malice. "Lost?" he asked, a crooked grin spreading across his face. "Just heading back to my campsite," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Beautiful day for a hike, isn't it?" He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be here." "Funny, I was just thinking the same thing," I said, attempting a disarming smile. He took a step closer. I noticed he was holding something. A hunting knife, its blade glinting ominously. "Folks around here don't take kindly to trespassers," he said. "Trespassing? I thought this was a national park," I replied, inching backward. "Belongs to those who respect the land," he hissed. His eyes were the most unnerving part, pale blue, almost colorless, like ice that had forgotten it was once water. They didn't blink as often as they should. His gaze traveled down to my hiking boots, then back up to my face, assessing me like a butcher sizing up a cut of meat. I decided then that conversation was overrated. Spinning on my heel, I bolted down the path. Adrenaline surged through me, and for a moment I felt like an Olympic sprinter, minus the cheering crowd and the gold medal. Behind me, I heard him give chase. His footsteps were heavy, but he was fast. Too fast. The trail forked, and without thinking, I veered left. Bad choice. The path led to a steep incline strewn with rocks. I scrambled upward, my legs burning with effort. "Can't run forever," he shouted. "Watch me," I yelled back, though I doubted the wisdom of taunting a knife-wielding maniac. My breath came in ragged gasps, the taste of copper filling my mouth. The undergrowth clawed at my clothes, branches slapped my face. I risked a glance back. He was gaining, moving with the fluid grace of someone who knew this terrain intimately. Reaching the top of the incline, I spotted a dilapidated cabin nestled among the trees. Smoke curled lazily from a makeshift chimney. Maybe someone inside could help, I thought, ignoring the warning bells clanging in my head. I sprinted toward the cabin and banged on the door. "Hello? Is anyone home? I need help." No answer. The door was ajar, and without hesitation, I pushed it open and stumbled inside. The cabin's interior hit me like a physical blow. Animal skulls adorned the walls, deer, wolf, bear, their empty eye sockets seeming to follow my movements. Pelts were stretched across wooden frames, some still wet with something. The stench of decay was overpowering, a rancid miasma that coated the back of my throat. On a wooden table lay various tools, skinning knives, bone saws, pliers, some rusty, others ominously clean. Jars filled with unidentifiable substances lined crude shelves. In one corner, a bundle of clothing lay in a heap. I noticed with rising horror that the fabric was torn and stained dark brown. "Well, this isn't the cozy cottage I was hoping for," I whispered. A quick survey of the room revealed no weapons besides the grisly tools, but I grabbed a hefty-looking fireplace poker. Footsteps approached the doorway, deliberate and unhurried. Come out, wherever you are," the man sang mockingly. I pressed myself against the wall beside the door, holding my breath. My palms were slick with sweat, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Sweat trickled down my spine despite the chill. As he stepped inside, I swung the poker with all my might. It connected with his forearm, causing him to drop the knife. He let out a deep, rage-filled shout. Before he could recover, I darted past him, knocking over a shelf of jars. They crashed to the floor, spilling their contents, a viscous liquid that smelled of rot and something darker. "You're only making it worse for yourself," he roared. I didn't stick around for further discussion. Racing back down the trail, I aimed for a different route, hoping to throw him off. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. "Next time, Dorian, maybe stick to beaches and pina coladas," I told myself. As I ran, the forest seemed to close in around me. Shadows stretched longer than they should have, and sounds became muffled, as if the woods themselves were conspiring with my pursuer. The air grew thick, each breath harder to draw than the last. I veered off the path, hoping to lose him in the dense underbrush. Thorns tore at my clothes, leaving stinging welts on my exposed skin. The ground dipped suddenly, and I found myself sliding down a muddy embankment, desperately grasping at roots and rocks to slow my descent. Landing hard at the bottom, I lay still for a moment, assessing the damage. Nothing broken, but my right ankle throbbed ominously. I pushed myself up, wincing at the pain that shot through my leg. The fall had taken me into a small ravine, sheltered by overhanging rock and thick vegetation. As I caught my breath, something caught my eye, a hint of unnatural color in the browns and greens of the forest floor. Limping closer, my stomach dropped. A shoe, not unlike my own hiking boot, protruded from beneath a pile of freshly turned earth and hastily gathered leaves. With trembling hands, I brushed away some of the covering. I stumbled upon a grisly sight, a shallow grave with a partially buried body. The exposed hand was pale, lifeless, the fingers curled as if still grasping for escape. The wrist bore a watch with a cracked face, stopped at 10:37. Nearby, a backpack lay ripped open, its contents strewn about, a map, a water bottle, and a journal. The journal's pages fluttered in the slight breeze, revealing neat handwriting transformed into frantic scrawls toward the end. I picked it up, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the pages. The final entry read, "I think someone's following me. Been hearing footsteps for the past hour. Probably just paranoid, but I'm heading back to camp. This place feels wrong somehow." Swallowing hard, I forced myself to keep moving. The reality of the danger was now stark and undeniable. This wasn't some territorial local trying to scare off tourists. This was something far more sinister. I tried to orient myself, to remember which direction would lead me back to my RV. The trees thinned ahead, suggesting a clearing. Hope surged through me. Perhaps I'd stumbled upon a campsite, maybe even Hank's. The trees opened up to reveal a small meadow. In the center stood a modestly sized tent, a camping chair, and the cold remains of a fire. But something was wrong. The tent flapped open, its entrance torn. The chair lay on its side, and the fire pit had been scattered, as if someone had kicked through it in a hurry. "No," I whispered, recognizing the distinctive red and gray pattern of Hank's tent. I approached cautiously, calling out his name. Silence answered. The tent was slashed to ribbons, and blood stained the ground nearby, dark, almost black against the trampled grass. A fishing rod lay broken beside the fire pit, and Hank's prized hunting knife, which he'd shown me proudly the day before, was embedded in a nearby tree trunk. "No, not Hank," I whispered. A noise behind me made me spin around. The man was there, his eyes wild, a second knife in his hand. He'd pursued me at a measured pace, confident in his knowledge of the terrain. Now he stood between me and the path back to safety, his thin lips curved in a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. He grinned. "The land demands sacrifice." "Look, if it's about the trout, I can catch you another one," I said, hysteria creeping into my voice. He charged forward, swinging the blade. I dodged, but not fast enough. A searing pain shot through my arm as the knife grazed me. Warm blood trickled down to my fingertips, each drop a reminder of my mortality. In a panic, I grabbed the fallen camping chair and hurled it at him. It struck his shoulder, causing him to stumble. Seizing the moment, I sprinted toward what I hoped was the direction of my RV, which was mercifully visible through the trees. My keys were in my pocket, and I fumbled to retrieve them, nearly dropping them in my haste. The forest blurred around me as I ran, my injured ankle protesting with every step. Behind me, I could hear him crashing through the underbrush, his breathing heavy but controlled. He wasn't tiring. If anything, the chase seemed to invigorate him. Reaching the RV, I yanked the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut just as he reached me. He pounded on the door, the window, his face a mask of fury pressed against the glass. His fist left smears of something dark, blood that wasn't his own. "There's nowhere to go," he screamed, his voice muffled by the barrier between us. "Funny, this thing's got wheels," I muttered, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, then finally roared to life. I threw it into gear and hit the gas. The RV lurched forward, knocking him aside. In the rearview mirror, I saw him pick himself up, a look of sheer hatred etched on his face. He began to run after the vehicle, moving with inhuman speed. The road was rough, but I didn't care. Branches scraped against the sides of the RV as I barreled down the unpaved path. My hands shook, blood from the cut on my arm staining the steering wheel. The wound throbbed in time with my racing heart. The trail widened, and I pushed the accelerator harder. The RV protested, its frame not designed for this kind of treatment, but I was beyond caring about mechanical integrity. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and that walking nightmare. A glance in the side mirror showed the man still in pursuit, though falling behind now. His determination was terrifying. What kind of person chases a motor vehicle on foot with such relentless purpose? The trail curved sharply, and I nearly lost control. The RV tilted alarmingly, two wheels briefly leaving the ground before slamming back down. My head hit the ceiling, and I tasted blood where I'd bitten my tongue. Come on, I urged the vehicle, patting the dashboard like it was a reluctant horse. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the main road. The sudden transition from rutted trail to smooth asphalt was jarring. I swerved, overcorrected, then finally straightened out. The speedometer climbed as I headed toward civilization, toward normality, toward safety. My mind raced faster than the RV. What had I stumbled into? Who was that man, and how many others had he hunted through those woods? The images from the cabin flashed through my mind. The tools, the pelts, the jars. I remembered Hank's campsite, the blood staining the ground. And worst of all, that shallow grave with its pale, accusing hand. I drove straight to the nearest town, a small community called Haines Junction. The sight of buildings, of streetlights, of people going about their ordinary lives nearly undid me. I parked haphazardly outside the local police station, not caring that I took up 3 spaces. Bursting through the doors, I must have been a sight, clothes torn, face scratched, blood drying on my arm. The officer at the desk rose immediately, hand instinctively moving to his holster. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "There's a man, in the woods. He tried to kill me." The words tumbled out in disjointed fragments. "He's killed others. There's a body. And Hank." The room tilted alarmingly, and I felt strong hands guiding me to a chair. Someone pressed a bottle of water into my hand, and I drank greedily, only now realizing how parched I was. An officer named Sergeant Billings listened attentively as I recounted everything in a rushing torrent of words. His weathered face grew increasingly grim as my story unfolded. "We've had reports of missing hikers in that area," he said gravely when I'd finished. "Sounds like you had a close call." They dispatched a team to investigate immediately. A paramedic cleaned and bandaged my arm while I waited, the shallow knife wound requiring 5 stitches. I provided a detailed description of the man, the cabin, and the locations of both Hank's campsite and the shallow grave I'd discovered. Hours later, Sergeant Billings returned. His expression told me everything before he spoke. "We found the cabin," he said, "but it had been set ablaze, reduced to smoldering ruins. No sign of the man or the bodies." "He's covering his tracks," I whispered. Billings nodded grimly. "But we'll find him. We've got search teams combing the area, and we've alerted Border Patrol. He won't get far." I wanted to believe him, but the memory of those cold blue eyes, so certain, so purposeful, made me doubt. That man knew those woods in a way the police never would. He was part of them somehow, as much a feature of the landscape as the trees and rocks. They put me up in a local motel for the night, posting an officer outside my door. Despite the exhaustion that pulled at my limbs, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, heard that voice. The land demands sacrifice. Days later, I learned that the man was believed to be Elias Crowther, a former wildlife guide who went off the grid years ago. Sergeant Billings showed me an old photograph, a younger, cleaner version of my attacker, but with the same unsettling eyes. He used to be one of the best guides in the territory, Billings explained. Knew the land better than anyone. Then he started getting strange, talking about the spirit of the wilderness and how modern visitors were desecrating sacred ground. What happened to him? I asked. No one knows for sure. Rumor had it he became obsessed with ancient rituals, believing that sacrifices were needed to protect the land from outsiders. He disappeared about 5 years ago. Most folks thought he'd gone south or died in the woods. Further investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. Over the past 4 years, 7 hikers had gone missing in Kluane National Park. All were solo travelers, mostly men, typically experienced outdoorsmen who wouldn't easily get lost. The authorities had attributed the disappearances to wildlife attacks, exposure, or simply the vast, unforgiving nature of the Yukon wilderness. Now, they were reopening those cases. The search for Elias Crowther continued, but the Yukon is a vast place. Thousands of square miles of pristine wilderness where a man who knows how to survive could disappear indefinitely. They found evidence of other campsites he'd used, all similarly equipped with tools for butchery, but no sign of the man himself. After giving my official statement, there was nothing more I could do. The cut on my arm would heal, leaving a scar to remind me of my brush with death. The nightmares I suspected would take longer to fade. In the final line of the report I was shown, it stated, Elias Crowther remains at large, driven by delusions that demand offerings to the wilderness he worships. I left the Yukon the next day, the open road ahead, and a newfound appreciation for the predictable dangers of city life. As I crossed the border back into the lower 48, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Distance, I hoped, would dilute the terror of those hours in the woods. But sometimes, on restless nights when sleep won't come, I find myself thinking about Elias Crowther. Is he still out there, moving through the trees like a shadow? Are there new carvings hanging from branches, new shallow graves hidden beneath the forest floor? How many more unwitting sacrifices has the land demanded through his hands? I think about Hank too. His easy laugh, his generous spirit. I wonder if anyone visits his final resting place, wherever that might be. I wonder if anyone remembers him besides me. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I no longer see wilderness as benign or beautiful. There's something primitive and uncompromising about true wilderness that modern humans have forgotten. We visit it like tourists, expecting it to welcome us, to bend to our will. We forget that for most of human history, the wild was something to be feared, respected, and ultimately survived. I returned to my accounting job, finding comfort in its predictability. Numbers don't lie. They don't hunt you through the woods or hang carvings from trees as warnings. They don't demand sacrifice. But sometimes, when I'm walking through a city park and the shadows lengthen, I find myself quickening my pace. When branches scrape against my apartment window on windy nights, I lie awake, listening. And when I meet someone new and they smile, I find myself studying their eyes, looking for that particular coldness I saw in Elias Crowther's gaze. In the official reports, in the newspapers, my story was sanitized, a disturbed man attacking hikers, a narrow escape. But I know the truth was darker, older somehow. There was something in those woods that wasn't just Elias Crowther, something that had claimed him long before he tried to claim me. The final update I received from Sergeant Billings came 6 months later. They'd found another campsite, another victim, but still no sign of Crowther himself. The email ended with what I suppose was meant to be reassurance. We'll catch him eventually. Men like that make mistakes. I wasn't so sure. Some men become so entwined with the darkness they serve that they cease to be men at all. They become something else. Something that doesn't make human mistakes because it has forgotten what humanity means. I never replied to that email. What could I say? That I believed Elias Crowther would never be caught? That he had become something beyond the reach of human justice, a force of nature, a dark spirit of the wilderness itself? Instead, I closed the file, deleted the email, and tried to move on. But I never returned to the outdoors, and I never will. Some sacrifices, it seems, the land does receive, even from those who escape its grasp. I never thought much about solitude until I took the assignment at Denali National Park in Alaska back in 2011. My name's Owen Mitchell, and I've been a park ranger for a few years now. The vast expanse of wilderness up here is something that both humbles and exhilarates you. There's a kind of quiet that settles into your bones, a stillness that's hard to find anywhere else. I grew up in a small town in Maine where the tallest thing around was the church steeple. The forests there were nothing compared to the endless stretches of pine and tundra in Denali. I moved here looking for a change of pace, maybe even a bit of adventure. On my days off, I'd hike trails that hadn't seen footprints in weeks, fishing rod in hand, hoping to catch dinner and a good story. Winter in Denali has a way of making you feel insignificant. The mountains loom like ancient gods, indifferent to your presence. The cold isn't just a temperature, it's an entity that hunts for any exposed skin, any weakness in your layers. Even the air feels different when you breathe it in, crisp and clean, but somehow heavy with silence. One morning in late October, I was assigned to check on some remote cabins used by researchers during the summer months. Winter was closing in, and we needed to make sure everything was secured before the heavy snows made the area inaccessible. My colleague, Laura Jenkins, was supposed to join me, but she'd called in sick with the flu. So I packed up my gear, loaded the snowmobile, and headed out alone. The ride out was smooth enough. The sky was a pale gray, the kind that makes you wonder if the sun ever truly rises here. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches weighed down by fresh snow. Occasionally, I'd spot a hare darting across the white canvas or catch the distant call of a raven. I remember thinking how beautiful it all was, in that stark, unforgiving way. The landscape seemed to stretch forever, unchanging and pristine. But there was something else that day, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. A tension in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. After a couple of hours, I reached the first cabin. Everything seemed in order. Windows locked, no signs of forced entry, supplies untouched. I noted it all on my checklist and moved on to the next one, about 5 miles deeper into the woods. As I approached the second cabin, something felt off. The door was ajar, swinging gently in the icy breeze. I parked the snowmobile and approached cautiously. "Hello? Anyone here?" I called out, half expecting a fellow ranger or maybe a lost hiker seeking shelter. There was no reply. Inside, the cabin was in disarray. Chairs were overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and a strange, musky odor permeated the air. It smelled like damp earth mixed with something metallic. I pulled out my flashlight and swept the beam across the room. Claw marks etched deep into the wooden walls caught my eye. 3 parallel lines, too wide for a bear and too deep for a wolverine. My stomach tightened. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen marks like these. They weren't made in panic or during a feeding frenzy. They were deliberate, almost methodical, like something marking its territory. I radioed back to the station. "This is Owen at Cabin 2. I've got signs of forced entry and possible animal activity. Over." Static was my only answer. I checked the device, tapped it a few times, but the signal was dead. "Great," I muttered. "Just great." Stepping back outside, I decided to inspect the perimeter. The snow around the cabin was disturbed, but not in any way I could easily read. The tracks were erratic, overlapping, and unlike any animal prints I'd seen before. They were large, almost oval, with what seemed like 4 toes ending in sharp indentations, claws maybe. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan air. As the wind picked up, it whistled through the trees, creating a sound almost like distant voices, whispering, calling. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. A joke came to mind about how I moved to the coldest place possible to avoid getting cold feet, but it fell flat even in my thoughts. The growing unease I felt wasn't something I could laugh away. Determined to finish my duty, I decided to head to the third and final cabin, about 7 miles further in. If something dangerous was out here, I needed to know. The sun was already beginning its early descent, painting long shadows across the snow. I glanced once more at the strange tracks before mounting my snowmobile. As I pulled away from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the tree line. Something that didn't want me here. Something that was waiting for me to make a mistake. The trail to the third cabin was rougher, less maintained. Branches reached out like skeletal hands, scraping against my jacket as I pushed through. The snowmobile vibrated beneath me, struggling against the deepening snow. The forest seemed to close in, the trees growing denser with each passing mile. About halfway there, the snowmobile sputtered and came to a halt. I tried the ignition. Nothing. The gauge showed empty. Out of fuel. Should have checked the gauge, genius, I scolded myself, the sound of my voice oddly comforting in the silence. I weighed my options. Turning back would mean trekking several miles on foot, but pressing onto the next cabin would at least offer shelter and possibly a working radio. I grabbed my backpack, tightened the straps, and moved forward. The forest grew denser, the trees crowding together as if sharing secrets. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of my boots against the snow. My breath came out in white plumes, hanging in the air before dissolving into nothing. The light was fading faster than I'd anticipated. In Denali, dusk doesn't linger. Night falls like a hammer. I quickened my pace, using my flashlight to guide the way. The beam cut through the darkness, creating more shadows than it dispelled. Then, in the distance, I heard a sound. Faint, but distinct. A sort of chittering, like the murmurs of a crowd heard through a wall. I paused, straining to listen. The noise stopped. Shrugging it off as the wind, I continued. But the sound picked up again, louder this time, seeming to come from all around me. I couldn't pinpoint a direction. It was disorienting, like being in a room with speakers hidden in every corner. Hello? Is someone out there? My voice sounded small amidst the towering pines. No answer came, but the noise ceased once more. I felt uneasy, like I was the punchline in a joke I didn't understand. I picked up the pace, eager to reach the cabin before nightfall. The temperature was dropping rapidly. I could feel the cold seeping through my gloves, numbing my fingers. My breath came harder now, forming clouds that momentarily obscured my vision. I kept my eyes on the ground, following what appeared to be a trail, though I couldn't be sure in the diminishing light. That's when I noticed them. Tracks in the snow. The same strange prints I'd seen at the second cabin, only fresher, more defined. They ran parallel to my path, sometimes crossing over it, as if whatever made them was walking alongside me, occasionally cutting in front. I stopped to examine one of the clearer impressions. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see details I'd missed before. The print was about 14 inches long, with 4 elongated toes that ended in sharp points. The middle toe was the longest, almost like a finger. There was something unsettlingly human about the arrangement, yet nothing human could leave marks like these. As I crouched there, studying the track, I heard a twig snap somewhere to my left. I straightened immediately, swinging my flashlight toward the sound. The beam caught nothing but trees and shadows. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The forest answered with silence, but I could feel eyes on me, watching, assessing. I remembered stories the native Athabascan guides would tell sometimes, tales of creatures that lived in the deepest parts of the wilderness, things that weren't quite animal but certainly not human either. I'd always listened politely, chalking it up to folklore born from the isolation and harsh conditions of the Alaskan interior. But standing there, alone in the gathering darkness, those stories didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. As the light began to fade completely, I finally saw the outline of the third cabin. Relief washed over me. The structure looked intact. Smoke even wafted gently from the chimney. Maybe someone's home, I thought, quickening my stride. I approached the cabin cautiously, noting that the strange tracks seemed to circle the structure, never approaching closer than about 20 feet. It was as if whatever made them was afraid to get too near, or was deliberately staying back, watching. I knocked on the door. "Anyone in there? This is Ranger Owen Mitchell." Silence. I tried the handle. It turned easily. Stepping inside, warmth greeted me, along with the comforting crackle of a fire. But the cabin appeared empty. A pot of something aromatic simmered over the hearth. On the table sat a mug of steaming tea. The whole scene was unsettling, like arriving late to a party where everyone had just stepped out. "Hello?" I called again, more cautiously. My flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing standard research equipment. A weather station readout, notebooks, a satellite phone that looked damaged. Everything seemed peaceful, ordinary even, except for one thing. On the wall opposite the door were the same 3-lined claw marks I'd seen at the second cabin, fresh enough that sap still oozed from the gouges in the wood. Then I saw it. A notebook lying open on the desk, pages filled with hurried handwriting. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached and began to read. The notebook was filled with the kind of handwriting that comes from someone writing in haste. Slanted, pressed hard into the paper, some words nearly illegible. I flipped through the first few pages, which contained ordinary research notes on wildlife migration patterns. But around page 15, the tone changed dramatically. Day 11. We've barricaded the doors and windows. Food supplies are low. The radio isn't working. Sarah is starting to panic. I flipped to the next entry. Day 12. The creature is more intelligent than we thought. It watches, studies. Last night it mimicked Jacob's voice. We almost opened the door. A cold knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't a research team I was aware of, and their observations didn't match any known predator behavior in the area. I turned another page. Day 13. If you're reading this, we didn't make it. The creature can imitate sounds, perhaps even voices. Do not trust anything you hear outside. Do not go into the woods at night. The last entry was dated just 2 days ago. I looked around the cabin with new eyes, noting details I'd missed before. The chair pushed against the door handle, the window sealed with duct tape, the emergency flares lined up on the counter, ready for use. Just then, a soft knock came at the door. I froze. "Owen, is that you?" A woman's voice called out. Laura's voice. My mind raced. Laura was sick back at the station, over 30 miles away. There was no way she could be here. "Owen, please open the door. I need help." I backed away, heart pounding. The door rattled as the knocking grew more insistent. "Let me in. It's cold out here." I glanced around for a weapon, anything. Grabbing a fireplace poker, I positioned myself near the back of the cabin. The door handle twisted slowly. I watched in horror as it opened, revealing not Laura, but something else entirely. It stood upright like a human, but was covered in coarse, matted fur. Its face was elongated, resembling that of a hyena, but with patches of bare skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Sharp teeth glinted as it pulled back cracked lips into a grotesque approximation of a smile. It stepped inside, moving with an unnatural grace. The creature tilted its head, eyes reflecting the firelight with a predatory gleam. "Stay back!" I shouted, brandishing the poker. It opened its mouth, and Laura's voice came out. "Owen, it's me. Don't you recognize me?" The voice was perfect. The same slight Virginia accent, the same way she'd say my name with the emphasis on the first syllable. But it came from this thing, this monstrosity that was certainly not Laura. A twisted sense of anger bubbled up. "That's not funny." The creature took another step forward. Without thinking, I swung the poker. It connected with a dull thud against the creature's arm. It let out a sound, a mix between a laugh and a snarl that sent a shiver down my spine. It lunged at me, and we both fell to the floor. Its claws tore at my jacket, narrowly missing flesh. The stench of its breath was overpowering, a foul mix of decay and damp earth. I kicked upwards, pushing it off me. Scrambling to my feet, I made a dash for the door. The creature was fast, but the cluttered cabin slowed it down. Bursting outside, I ran blindly into the woods. Behind me, the creature gave chase, crashing through the underbrush. The fading light made it difficult to see, but I didn't dare slow down. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me with every step. I could hear it gaining on me, its breathing a ragged wheeze that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. The forest itself seemed alive, conspiring against me, branches reaching out to snag my clothing, roots rising to catch my feet. Ahead, I spotted a narrow ravine. Without time to think, I leaped across, barely making it to the other side. I heard the creature skid to a halt behind me. For a moment, there was silence. Then it began to mimic again. This time, it was my own voice. "Help! Somebody help me!" The effect was unnerving. Hearing my own pleas echoed back at me almost made me stop, but I pressed on. The creature let out a frustrated howl, then began to pace along the edge of the ravine, searching for a way across. I took the opportunity to put more distance between us, diving deeper into the forest. The darkness was almost complete now, but the moon provided just enough light to navigate by. My lungs burned, each breath a struggle in the cold air. After what felt like hours, I emerged into a clearing. Moonlight illuminated an old maintenance shed we hadn't used in years. I ducked inside, bolting the door behind me. The shed was small, filled with rusted tools and old equipment. I searched frantically for anything useful. In the corner, I found a flare gun with one shot left. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. A scratching sound came from the door. Then the creature spoke in another voice, my father's, whom I hadn't seen in years. "Son, open up, it's okay." My hands shook as I loaded the flare gun. "You're not real," I whispered. The door creaked as the creature began to force its way in. Wooden splinters flew as its claws tore through. As it squeezed through the gap, I fired the flare gun. The bright light hit the creature square in the chest, igniting its fur. It let out a shriek unlike anything I'd ever heard, thrashing wildly as flames consumed it. Seizing the moment, I kicked open a loose plank on the side of the shed and slipped out. The creature was distracted, giving me a precious few minutes to put distance between us. I stumbled upon an old service trail and followed it until I saw headlights in the distance. A park maintenance truck was idling, 2 rangers inside finishing up their rounds. Waving my arms, I shouted, "Hey, over here!" They saw me and pulled up. "Oh, and what the hell happened to you?" One of them, Mark, asked, eyes wide. I must have been a sight, clothes torn, face scratched, eyes wild with fear. But I was alive, and at that moment, nothing else mattered. The ride back to the ranger station was a blur. Mark and his partner Dave tried to get me to explain what happened, but I couldn't find the words. How do you tell someone you were attacked by a creature that shouldn't exist? That it could mimic voices with perfect accuracy? That it had intelligence behind its predatory eyes? "There's something out here," I finally managed to say. "We need to get back to the station now." They didn't ask any more questions, sensing the urgency in my voice. As we drove away, I glanced back toward the tree line. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a pair of eyes reflecting in the darkness, but it could have been a trick of the light. Back at the station, I reported everything to Chief Ranger Hollister, a veteran who'd been working in Denali for over 20 years. He listened without interruption, his weathered face giving nothing away. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Owen, you know how this sounds, right?" "I know exactly how it sounds," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt inside. "But I know what I saw." Hollister nodded slowly. "We'll send a team out first thing tomorrow to check the cabins and look for this creature." He chose his words carefully. "In the meantime, get some rest. You've had a hell of a day." I couldn't argue with that. My body ached, and exhaustion was setting in now that the adrenaline had worn off. But sleep seemed impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing standing in the doorway, speaking with Laura's voice. The next morning, a search team was dispatched, 6 rangers, including Mark and Dave, all armed and equipped with radios and emergency flares. I wanted to go with them, but Hollister insisted I stay behind. "You need to recover," he said, but I could tell he was worried about my state of mind. They returned late that afternoon. They'd found the second cabin just as I described, furniture overturned, claw marks on the walls. But the third cabin was empty. No pot on the stove, no steaming mug, no notebook. And the shed I'd taken refuge in was burned to the ground, the fire attributed to a faulty propane tank that had been stored inside. As for tracks, they found plenty. Moose, wolf, even a bear that had wandered through recently. But nothing matching my description of the creature's prints. The snow had been disturbed in places, but a light snowfall overnight had obscured much of the evidence. Officially, it was written off as a bear attack, with my more fantastical observations attributed to hypothermia and shock. Unofficially, those of us who knew kept a wary eye on the woods. A week later, a group of hikers went missing in the same area. Their bodies were found days later, showing signs of an animal attack, though the details didn't add up. The patterns were too erratic, the injuries unlike those from any known predator. The park was temporarily closed for investigation. Wildlife specialists were brought in from Anchorage and even as far as Seattle, but no definitive answers emerged. They talked about unusual wolf behavior, possibly a rabid bear, or even a wolverine protecting its territory. None of those explanations satisfied me. During this time, I did some research of my own. I spoke with local Athabascan elders about the legends they'd grown up with. One story in particular caught my attention. The tale of the Nalugwijut, a creature that could change its voice to lure hunters away from their camps. "It is very old," one elder told me, his eyes distant as if looking back through countless winters. "Older than the mountains, perhaps. It sleeps for many years, then awakens hungry." "How do you stop it?" I asked. He smiled sadly. "You don't. You recognize its tricks and stay away. It is not evil, not as you understand it. It is like the winter, harsh, deadly, but part of this land. I also discovered that the research team whose notebook I'd found had never officially existed. According to park records, no team had been assigned to that cabin this season. When I mentioned the names from the notebook, Sarah and Jacob, Hollister looked at me strangely. Owen, Sarah Matthews was a researcher who worked here 5 years ago. She disappeared during a solo expedition. Jacob Chen was her colleague who went looking for her. He never came back either. A chill ran down my spine. That's impossible. The notebook entry was dated 2 days before I found it. Hollister shook his head. I don't know what to tell you. Maybe someone's playing a sick joke. But I knew it wasn't a joke. Something was out there, something that had been hunting in these woods for a very long time. As for Laura, she recovered from her flu and returned to duty. When I told her about the creature using her voice, she laughed it off, but I could see the uneasiness in her eyes. She started taking a different route on her patrols, avoiding the area where I'd had my encounter. Sometimes, late at night when the wind howled around the station, I'd catch her listening intently, as if trying to distinguish between the natural sounds of the wilderness and something else, something that might be calling her name. As for me, I took some time off. The wilderness that once felt like home now seemed alien, every rustling leaf a potential threat. The doctors called it acute stress reaction, a fancy term for being scared out of your wits. But I knew it was more than that. I'd glimpsed something that existed in the narrow space between legend and reality, and it had changed me. Before I left, I installed additional warning signs around the perimeter of that section of the park. One of the maintenance guys laughed, saying I was being overly cautious. Better safe than sorry, I replied with a half smile. As I packed up my truck to leave, Mark approached me. Heading out? Just for a bit, I said, securing the last of my bags. Take care of yourself, Owen. We'll hold down the fort. I nodded. Keep an eye out, okay? He gave me a curious look but didn't press further. Of all my colleagues, Mark came the closest to believing my story. He'd been the one to find the most unusual evidence, a tuft of coarse fur caught on a tree branch near the burned shed. The lab results came back inconclusive, the sample contaminated or degraded, they said. I spent a month with my sister in Oregon, where the forests were different, younger, more domesticated somehow. At night, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the echo of that creature's mimicry still ringing in my ears. But gradually, the nightmares became less frequent, the memories less vivid. By the time December rolled around, I felt ready to return. Denali in winter is a different beast altogether, harsher, more isolated, but also more honest. There's no pretense in 40 below zero. It tells you exactly what it is and what it can do to you. Hollister welcomed me back without fanfare, assigning me to maintenance duty at the main visitor center, well away from the remote cabins where I'd had my encounter. I was grateful for the mundane work and the company of other rangers, but I couldn't stay away forever. One clear February day, I volunteered for a supply run to the weather station just outside the area where the creature had been. Hollister hesitated but eventually agreed, on the condition that I take another ranger with me. Laura volunteered, surprising everyone, including herself, it seemed. Someone's got to keep you out of trouble, she said with forced lightness. The trip out was uneventful. The snow lay deep and undisturbed, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to go on forever. We made good time, delivered the supplies, and were heading back by early afternoon. As we approached the area where I'd first seen the strange tracks, Laura slowed her snowmobile. Let's take a different route, she said over the radio. I nodded, relieved that she'd suggested it first. We veered west, adding an hour to our journey but giving the area a wide berth. As we traveled, I noticed Laura kept looking over her shoulder, scanning the tree line behind us. You see something? I asked when we stopped to refuel. She hesitated. No, just being careful. But there was something in her eyes, a recognition that told me she'd experienced something too, something she wasn't ready to talk about. On our way back, we passed one of my warning signs, now half buried in snow. Laura brushed it off, reading the words aloud. Danger, do not proceed alone. Report any unusual activity. Do you think it's still out there? She asked quietly. I looked toward the distant mountains, their peaks catching the last rays of the setting sun. Yes, I said simply. I think it's always been out there. She nodded slowly. I believe you, about what happened. I turned to her, surprised. Why? You weren't there? 2 weeks ago, I was doing a solo patrol near the edge of the restricted area, she said, her voice low as if she was afraid of being overheard. I heard someone call my name. It sounded like you, but I knew you were at the station that day. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. What did you do? I got the hell out of there, she said with a weak smile. Didn't even look back. But I've been thinking about what you said, about it mimicking voices. Makes me wonder how many people it's lured into the deep woods over the years. We finished our journey in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. Back at the station, life went on. The park reopened fully by spring, the mysterious deaths attributed to an unusually aggressive wolf that had since moved on or been killed by hunters. Most people accepted the explanation, eager to put the troubling events behind them. As for the creature, there were no more confirmed sightings, though rumors persisted. A backpacker claimed to have heard his girlfriend calling for help, only to find her safely asleep in their tent. A pilot reported seeing something large and bipedal moving through a clearing, too big to be a bear, too fast to be a moose. Driving away from Denali that spring for a much-needed vacation, I couldn't shake the feeling that something old and cunning was out there, something that didn't appreciate uninvited guests. The park remains one of the most beautiful places I've ever known, but beauty often hides secrets best left undisturbed. Sometimes when the wind blows a certain way, I think I can hear whispering, voices calling from the wilderness, trying to sound like someone I know. And I wonder how many others have heard those calls and followed them into the dark, never to return. I still work in Denali. I couldn't stay away if I tried. But I'm more cautious now, more aware of the thin line between the world we know and the one we don't. And I never, ever go into the deep woods alone. The wilderness is vast and ancient, and we are just visitors here, tolerated but not truly welcome. There are places where humanity's foothold is tenuous at best, places where other things have held dominion since long before we arrived. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, those things remind us of our place in the natural order. They whisper our names, in voices we trust, and wait for us to answer.